Hello, my curious friends. Tonight we'll be exploring one of the most unsettling chapters in modern history, a conspiracy that was once dismissed, mocked, and denied, until it was quietly proven true. This is a slow, factual deep dive into the MKUltra program, designed for background listening, relaxation, and sleep. There are no sound effects, no dramatic music, just a calm walk through documented history. If you enjoy long-form stories like this, feel free to support the channel with a like or subscribe. And if you're listening as you wind down, you're welcome to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're tuning in from. I always enjoy seeing how these late-night histories connect listeners across time zones. And if there's a true story, hidden history, or real-life conspiracy you'd like to hear explored next, let me know. I'll do my best to bring it to life. Let's dive in. In the aftermath of World War II, the world had been fundamentally transformed. The conflict had introduced weapons of unprecedented destructive power, tactics of unimaginable brutality, and technologies that seemed to belong to the realm of science fiction. As the dust settled and the victorious Allied powers began to examine what had transpired during those dark years, American intelligence agencies made a series of unsettling discoveries. Among the ruins of the Third Reich and in classified Japanese research facilities, they found evidence of experiments that pushed the boundaries of human ethics and scientific inquiry. But perhaps more troubling than what they found was what they feared their adversaries might possess. U.S. intelligence agencies began to operate under a growing and deeply troubling assumption. They feared that enemy powers, particularly the Soviet Union and Communist China, had somehow mastered techniques of mind control. This wasn't the stuff of pulp fiction or conspiracy theories in the minds of these intelligence professionals. To them, it was a genuine strategic threat that kept them awake at night. The fear was rooted in both evidence and imagination, a combination that would prove particularly dangerous. The evidence, such as it was, came from multiple sources. There were reports emerging from behind the Iron Curtain, fragmentary and difficult to verify, that suggested Soviet scientists were conducting research into psychological manipulation and behavioral control. Intelligence analysts pored over these reports, trying to separate fact from fiction, signal from noise. But in the fog of the Cold War, certainty was a luxury they couldn't afford. Then came the Korean War, and with it, reports that seemed to confirm their worst fears. American prisoners of war were returning home, and some of them were behaving strangely. They made confessions that seemed out of character. They denounced their country and embraced communist ideology in ways that struck observers as unnatural, as though they had been fundamentally altered. Reports claimed that American POWs were being psychologically broken through techniques that went beyond traditional interrogation or even torture. The term brainwashing entered the American vocabulary during this period. It was borrowed from a Chinese phrase and popularized by a journalist named Edward Hunter, who himself had ties to the intelligence community. The concept took hold in the public imagination, but more importantly, it took hold in the minds of those responsible for national security. If the enemy could truly rewire a person's thoughts and loyalties, if they could turn American soldiers into unwitting agents of communist ideology, then the implications were staggering. Within the Central Intelligence Agency, a conviction began to solidify. The human mind, they believed, was the next battlefield. This wasn't merely metaphorical. They saw it as a literal theater of conflict, one where wars could be won or lost based on who could better understand and manipulate human consciousness. If the Soviets or Chinese had made advances in this area, the United States couldn't afford to fall behind. The prospect of a mind gap seemed as threatening as any missile gap. This shift in thinking was very much a product of its time. Cold War paranoia shaped intelligence priorities in profound ways. Every aspect of Soviet society was analyzed for potential threats. Every scientific advance behind the Iron Curtain was viewed through a lens of suspicion. The competition between the superpowers wasn't limited to nuclear weapons or conventional military forces. It extended to every domain where one side might gain an advantage over the other. And in this environment, psychological warfare became a national security obsession. The obsession manifested in numerous ways. Academic research into psychology and behavioral science received new attention and funding. Military planners incorporated psychological operations into their strategic thinking. Intelligence agencies recruited psychiatrists, psychologists, and researchers from universities across the country. The question wasn't whether to pursue this research, but how far to go and how quickly to move. Within this context, the CIA formulated its objectives with stark clarity. The agency sought methods to control thoughts, memory, and behavior. These weren't abstract goals. They wanted to find ways to extract information from unwilling subjects, to plant false memories, to alter a person's personality or allegiances. They wanted to be able to create amnesia, to make someone forget what they had seen or done. They wanted to understand if it was possible to program a human being the way one might program a machine. The scope of what they envisioned was breathtaking in its ambition and troubling in its implications. They considered using drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, verbal and physical abuse, and a range of other techniques. They wanted to explore the outer limits of human psychology and consciousness, to find the breaking points and the mechanisms of control. And they wanted to do it in secret, away from public scrutiny or ethical oversight. This brings us to a crucial aspect of how MKUltra came to be. Existing ethical frameworks were seen as obstacles rather than safeguards. In the universities and research institutions where most legitimate psychological research took place, there were protocols and review boards. There were ethical standards about informed consent, about not causing harm to research subjects. These standards had emerged in part as a response to the revelations about Nazi medical experiments during the Nuremberg trials. The world had collectively recoiled at what had been done in the name of science, and new ethical boundaries had been established. But within the CIA, there was a growing belief that these ethical frameworks couldn't apply to their work. National security, they argued, operated in a different moral universe. The stakes were too high, and the enemy was too ruthless to be constrained by peacetime ethics. This rationalization allowed them to contemplate research that would have been immediately rejected in any legitimate academic or medical setting. Secrecy was considered essential to success. This was true on multiple levels. Obviously, they didn't want the Soviet Union to know what they were researching, but more than that, they didn't want the American public to know. They didn't want oversight from Congress or scrutiny from the press. They wanted the freedom to operate in the shadows, to pursue their research without interference or accountability. The culture of secrecy that pervaded the intelligence community during the Cold War enabled this. It created spaces where normal rules didn't apply, where activities could be conducted without external review. The agency operated under a belief that would prove central to everything that followed. They believed that extraordinary threats justified extraordinary measures. This wasn't mere convenience or opportunism. It was a genuine conviction held by serious people who saw themselves as defenders of freedom and democracy. They believed they were engaged in an existential struggle against totalitarian communism. They believed that if they didn't pursue every possible advantage, if they didn't explore every avenue of research, they would be failing in their duty to protect the nation. This worldview created a kind of moral inversion. Actions that would normally be considered unconscionable could be reframed as necessary. Violating the rights and dignity of individuals could be justified in the name of protecting the collective. The ends came to justify the means in ways that eroded the very values the agency claimed to be defending. This mindset, this combination of fear and ambition, of paranoia and determination, laid the groundwork for MKUltra. The program didn't emerge from nowhere. It wasn't the creation of a few rogue actors or mad scientists. It was the logical extension of a set of beliefs and priorities that had taken hold within the highest levels of American intelligence. When the program was officially authorized in 1953, it represented the culmination of years of thinking about psychological warfare and the weaponization of human consciousness. The director of Central Intelligence at the time, Allen Dulles, approved the program. Under the leadership of chemist Sidney Gottlieb, MKUltra would go on to encompass hundreds of secret experiments. But at its inception, it was built on the foundation of ideas we've been discussing: the fear of enemy mind control, the reports from Korea, the conviction that the mind was a battlefield, the Cold War paranoia, the obsession with psychological warfare, the desire to control thoughts and behavior, the rejection of ethical constraints, the insistence on absolute secrecy, and the belief that any measure, however extreme, could be justified in the face of the communist threat. Looking back from our vantage point, it's easy to see the flaws in this thinking. We know now that many of the reports about communist brainwashing were exaggerated or misunderstood. We know that the techniques the CIA sought to develop were far less effective than they hoped and far more damaging to their subjects than they anticipated. We know that the ethical lines they crossed caused immense suffering and violated fundamental human rights. But in that moment, in the early 1950s, to those who authorized and conducted these programs, it all seemed not just justified, but necessary. The story of MKUltra is many things. It's a story about the excesses of the intelligence community. It's a story about what happens when secrecy eliminates accountability. It's a story about the victims who suffered in experiments they never consented to. But it's also a story about a particular moment in history, when fear and ideology combined to make the unthinkable seem not just possible, but imperative. Understanding how it began helps us understand how such things can happen, and perhaps how to ensure they don't happen again. On April 13, 1953, a memorandum crossed the desk of Allen Dulles, the director of Central Intelligence. The document proposed a new program, one that would coordinate and expand the agency's existing efforts in what it termed special interrogation and behavioral modification. Dulles reviewed the proposal, and with his signature, MKUltra was formally authorized. It was a decision that would have consequences far beyond what anyone in that room could have imagined. Allen Dulles was not a man prone to hesitation or self-doubt. He came from a family of public servants and had spent years in the world of intelligence, first in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, and then in the CIA. He was urbane, well-connected, and absolutely convinced of the righteousness of America's cause in the Cold War. When he approved MKUltra, he did so with the full weight of his authority and with complete confidence that it was necessary. He saw it as no different from developing a new weapons system or establishing a spy network. It was simply another tool in the arsenal against communism. The program was placed under the authority of the CIA's Technical Services Staff. This was the division responsible for developing gadgets, forgeries, disguises, and other tools of espionage. It was a world of hidden cameras and secret inks, of lockpicks and concealed weapons. On the surface, it might have seemed an odd home for a program focused on human psychology and behavioral modification, but there was a logic to it. The technical services staff was accustomed to working on sensitive projects. They understood operational security, and they had the infrastructure to move money and resources without attracting attention. The man chosen to lead MKUltra was Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who had joined the CIA in 1951. Gottlieb was, by all accounts, a complex figure. He had a club foot from childhood polio, and some who knew him suggested this physical difference had made him empathetic to outsiders and underdogs. He was interested in folk dancing and grew Christmas trees on his farm in Virginia. He seemed in many ways an unlikely candidate to oversee a program that would involve some of the most ethically troubling experiments in American history. But Gottlieb was also ambitious, brilliant, and completely devoted to the mission as he understood it. He believed deeply that the CIA needed to master these techniques before the Soviets did, and he was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to make that happen. From its inception, MKUltra was designed as a broad, open-ended experiment. This wasn't a focused research project with specific hypotheses to test and clear endpoints. It was designed to cast the widest possible net, to explore every conceivable avenue that might lead to methods of controlling human behavior. The authorization documents gave Gottlieb and his team enormous latitude. They could pursue chemical approaches, psychological approaches, biological approaches. They could investigate drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and countless other techniques. The program was structured to encourage innovation and risk-taking, to reward those who thought outside conventional boundaries. This open-ended nature was both a strength and a danger. It allowed researchers to follow unexpected leads and to pivot quickly when something showed promise. But it also meant there was no clear roadmap, no defined scope. Projects could sprawl in unexpected directions. Experiments could become more extreme without triggering any automatic review. The very flexibility that was seen as an asset became, in practice, a license for excess. Crucially, there were no clear limits placed on methods. The authorization didn't specify what techniques were acceptable and what were beyond the pale. There were no explicit prohibitions against causing pain, inducing trauma, or permanently damaging subjects. The assumption seemed to be that the researchers would use their judgment, that the importance of the mission would justify whatever measures proved necessary. This absence of boundaries wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. The architects of the program believed that imposing limits might prevent them from discovering something vital. They wanted the freedom to push as hard as necessary, to test the absolute extremes of what was possible. Oversight was minimal by design. In most scientific research, there are layers of review and accountability. Institutional review boards examine proposed experiments. Peer review processes evaluate methodologies and findings. Funding agencies track how money is spent and what results are achieved. None of these safeguards applied to MKUltra. The program reported only to a tiny circle within the CIA leadership. Even within the agency, most personnel had no idea what was being done. Congressional oversight, such as it existed for intelligence matters in that era, didn't extend to operational details like this. The program existed in a gray zone where normal accountability structures simply didn't reach. This minimal oversight was justified on security grounds. The fewer people who knew about MKUltra, the less chance there was of leaks or exposure. But it also meant there was no one asking difficult questions. There was no one challenging assumptions or demanding justification for increasingly extreme experiments. The researchers working on MKUltra projects operated with an autonomy that would have been unthinkable in any other context. They answered only to Gottlieb, and Gottlieb answered only to a handful of senior CIA officials who were predisposed to give him whatever he needed. The authorization explicitly included human experimentation. This wasn't hidden in vague language or left to inference. The program was, from the start, designed to test its techniques on human subjects. The question wasn't whether to experiment on people, but how to do so in ways that served the program's goals. This was a profound departure from accepted medical and scientific ethics. The Nuremberg Code, established just 6 years earlier in response to Nazi atrocities, had set clear standards for human experimentation. It required voluntary consent from subjects who were fully informed about what would be done to them. It required that experiments be designed to avoid unnecessary suffering. MKUltra violated these principles from the outset. The absence of informed consent was baked into the program's design. Informed consent was not required. This wasn't an unfortunate compromise or a temporary expedient. It was a fundamental feature of how MKUltra operated. The researchers believed, and were supported in this belief by their superiors, that informed consent would undermine the validity of their experiments. If subjects knew they were being tested, if they knew they had been given drugs or subjected to psychological manipulation, they might respond differently than they would in operational settings. The goal was to study people's reactions under conditions that mimicked real-world espionage or interrogation scenarios. And in those scenarios, the enemy wouldn't ask for permission. This logic led to a situation where subjects were often unaware they were being studied. They might be psychiatric patients who thought they were receiving legitimate treatment. They might be prisoners who believed they were participating in programs that could reduce their sentences. They might be volunteers for medical studies who had no idea that the CIA was funding the research or that the drugs being tested were part of an intelligence program. In some of the most notorious cases, they were simply people going about their daily lives who were dosed with LSD or other substances without any warning or explanation. The people selected as subjects fell into several categories. Some were deemed expendable by the standards of the time. These included prisoners, drug addicts, prostitutes, and psychiatric patients. The reasoning, though never stated so bluntly in official documents, was that these were people whose complaints would be dismissed, who had limited recourse to legal or social protections. Others were CIA employees or military personnel who were seen as having implicitly consented to unusual risks by virtue of their positions. Still others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, random individuals who became subjects of opportunity. As the program expanded, MKUltra became one of the CIA's most secret programs. It was compartmentalized even within the intelligence community. Agents working on one MKUltra project might have no knowledge of other projects. Research was conducted through a web of universities, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and private foundations. Funding was often disguised, laundered through front organizations with innocuous names. Contracts were written in deliberately vague language. Results were reported through secure channels and stored in safes to which only a few people had access. The secrecy extended to record-keeping. Files on MKUltra were maintained separately from the CIA's general archives. They were given special classification levels. Even the code name itself was designed to obscure. The MK prefix was used for several CIA programs dealing with behavioral modification, and Ultra invoked the famous British code-breaking operation from World War II, though there was no direct connection. The name was meant to be innocuous, to reveal nothing about the program's actual nature if someone happened to see it in a document. This obsessive secrecy served multiple purposes. It protected operational details from foreign intelligence services. It prevented American allies who might have ethical objections from learning what was being done. It kept the American public in the dark about activities that would have provoked outrage if exposed. And perhaps most importantly, it created an environment where the program could operate without external constraint, where the researchers and administrators answered only to themselves and to their own increasingly warped sense of what was necessary. The structure that emerged in those early years set the template for everything that followed. a program with immense resources and minimal oversight, freed from ethical constraints, operating in absolute secrecy, with explicit authorization to experiment on unwitting human subjects. It was a combination that made abuse not just possible, but virtually inevitable. The safeguards that exist to prevent such abuses had been deliberately stripped away in the name of national security. And once that architecture was in place, once those precedents were established, it became easier and easier to push boundaries further, to justify the next experiment, the next violation, the next step into darker territory. What began as a single program quickly metastasized into something far larger and more complex than its architects had initially envisioned. MKUltra eventually included at least 149 sub-projects. This number alone is staggering, but it barely captures the true scope of what was undertaken. Each sub-project was itself a distinct research effort, often involving multiple experiments, numerous subjects, and various researchers. Some sub-projects lasted months, others ran for years. Some involved a handful of test subjects, others dozens or more. Together, they represented an enormous investment of resources, personnel, and institutional focus. The sub-projects covered an extraordinary range of activities. Some investigated the effects of specific drugs on human consciousness and behavior. Lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, was a particular focus, but researchers also studied mescaline, psilocybin, barbiturates, amphetamines, and countless other substances, including some that were specially synthesized for these experiments. Other sub-projects explored non-chemical methods. There were studies of hypnosis and whether it could be used to create programmable agents or extract information. There were experiments with sensory deprivation, keeping subjects in isolation tanks or darkened rooms for extended periods. There were investigations into electroshock therapy, not as treatment, but as a tool for erasing memories or breaking down personality structures. Some sub-projects ventured into even more exotic territory. Researchers studied whether specific radio frequencies could influence brain function. They investigated whether subliminal messages could alter behavior. They explored the potential of using combinations of drugs, hypnosis, and psychological stress to create dissociative states or artificial personalities. The creativity was boundless, limited only by imagination and the willingness to disregard ethical boundaries. And in the world of MKUltra, there seemed to be no shortage of either. The experiments took place across the United States and Canada. This geographic spread was partly practical. The CIA needed to tap into expertise wherever it existed, and the leading researchers in psychiatry, psychology, and pharmacology were scattered across the continent. But the dispersal also served the program's security needs. By spreading activities across dozens of locations, the CIA made it harder for anyone to see the full picture. A researcher in California working on one aspect of the program would have no idea what was happening in a laboratory in New York or a hospital in Montreal. Even if someone became suspicious about a particular experiment, they couldn't know whether it was an isolated incident or part of something larger. Universities, hospitals, prisons, and military sites were all used as venues for MKUltra research. Universities were particularly attractive because they had both the scientific expertise and the institutional legitimacy. A study conducted at a respected university carried an automatic credibility that work done at a CIA facility never could. Hospitals provided access to patients and to medical equipment. Prisons offered captive populations who could be studied over extended periods. Military sites gave researchers access to personnel who were already subject to military discipline and secrecy requirements. The institutions chosen represented some of the most prestigious names in American medicine and academia. Research was conducted at Columbia University, Stanford University, and the University of Rochester, among many others. McGill University in Montreal became the site of some of the program's most disturbing experiments. The Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, a facility for treating drug addiction, became a de facto CIA laboratory. The network extended to smaller institutions as well, to private hospitals and research foundations scattered across the continent. What makes this even more troubling is that many institutions did not know the CIA was funding the research. The agency used elaborate mechanisms to hide its involvement. Grant applications would come from seemingly legitimate foundations. Contracts would be signed with organizations that appeared to be private entities focused on public health or scientific advancement. Researchers might be told they were working on projects funded by the Department of Defense or by philanthropic organizations, with no mention of the CIA. Even institutional administrators who approved the research often had no idea of its true origins or ultimate purpose. Front organizations disguised the agency's involvement with remarkable effectiveness. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, based at Cornell University, was one such front. It presented itself as an academic research organization interested in understanding human behavior in various environmental and social contexts. In reality, it was a CIA creation established specifically to fund MKUltra-related research while maintaining plausible deniability. The Geschichte Fund for Medical Research was another front, ostensibly a private foundation supporting cancer research and other medical studies. In fact, it channeled CIA money to MKUltra sub-projects while appearing completely independent. These fronts were sophisticated operations. They had boards of directors, published reports, held conferences. They maintained the full apparatus of legitimate organizations. Some of the people involved in these fronts were aware of the CIA connection and actively complicit, but others were genuinely deceived, believing they were working for the organizations they appeared to be working for. The layers of deception were elaborate enough that unraveling the true funding sources later became a significant challenge. The researchers themselves occupied a spectrum of awareness and complicity. Some researchers knowingly collaborated with the CIA. They understood exactly who was funding their work and why. These individuals made a conscious choice to participate in intelligence operations, to apply their scientific expertise to the development of interrogation and control techniques. Some were motivated by patriotism, believing they were serving their country in a time of existential threat. Others were drawn by the resources the CIA could provide, by access to subjects and materials that would be impossible to obtain through normal channels. Still others seemed motivated by scientific curiosity pushed to its darkest extreme, by a desire to explore questions that conventional ethics would never permit. But others were unwitting participants in the program. These researchers believed they were conducting legitimate scientific studies. They thought they were advancing human knowledge or developing therapeutic techniques. They had no idea that their work was being monitored by the CIA, that their findings were being evaluated for intelligence applications, that their research might be used in interrogations or covert operations. When they published papers or presented at conferences, they had no sense that they were contributing to a classified program. This exploitation of unwitting researchers raises profound questions about scientific integrity and the corruption of the research enterprise. The test subjects themselves came from various segments of society, but they shared a common vulnerability. Civilians were included as test subjects in numerous experiments. Some were recruited under false pretenses, told they were participating in studies of one kind when the actual purpose was entirely different. Others were dosed with drugs without any warning whatsoever. There are documented cases of CIA officers spiking each other's drinks with LSD as part of internal testing, but the practice extended beyond the agency. People at bars, at parties, and social settings became unwitting subjects. One particularly notorious series of experiments, known as Operation Midnight Climax, involved CIA-run safe houses in San Francisco and New York, where prostitutes dosed clients with LSD while agents watched through two-way mirrors. Prison inmates were frequently used in MKUltra experiments. Prisons offered several advantages from the perspective of researchers who had abandoned ethical constraints. Inmates were a captive population who couldn't simply walk away from experiments. Their movements and activities could be controlled and monitored, and perhaps most cynically, inmates could be incentivized or coerced into participation. At the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, drug-dependent inmates were offered their drug of choice in exchange for participating in experiments. They would endure days or even weeks of being given experimental compounds, suffering through unknown side effects and reactions, in order to receive the heroin or morphine they craved. It was exploitation of the most vulnerable, dressed up as voluntary participation. Psychiatric patients were considered especially valuable targets for MKUltra research. Patients in mental institutions were already experiencing altered states of consciousness and unusual behaviors. Researchers could conduct experiments and attribute any resulting symptoms or changes to the patient's underlying conditions rather than to the interventions. Moreover, psychiatric patients had limited credibility. If they later claimed they had been subjected to bizarre experiments, who would believe them? Their very presence in a mental institution could be used to discredit their testimony. The experiments conducted on psychiatric patients were among the most brutal in the entire MKUltra program. At McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute, Dr. Ewan Cameron conducted experiments that went far beyond anything that could be justified therapeutically. Cameron, who was a respected psychiatrist and had served as president of the American Psychiatric Association, believed he could erase pathological behaviors and rebuild healthy personalities from scratch. With CIA funding, he subjected patients to intensive electroshock therapy far beyond standard protocols. He kept patients in drug-induced comas for weeks at a time. He used sensory deprivation and played recorded messages to patients continuously, sometimes for weeks on end, in an attempt to implant new thought patterns. Cameron's patients had come to him seeking help for depression, anxiety, and other treatable conditions. What they experienced instead was a systematic assault on their minds and identities. Some emerged from his treatment with significant memory loss, unable to recognize family members or recall basic information about their lives. Others suffered permanent psychological damage. The institutional setting gave Cameron almost unlimited access to vulnerable patients, and the CIA funding allowed him to pursue his theories with resources and intensity that would have been impossible otherwise. The use of these vulnerable populations reveals something fundamental about how MKUltra operated. The program systematically targeted people who had limited ability to resist, to complain, or to seek justice. It exploited existing power imbalances and social marginalization. The researchers didn't experiment on themselves or on their colleagues except in superficial ways. They didn't recruit the educated and well-connected as subjects. Instead, they chose people who could be used and discarded, whose suffering could be kept hidden, whose voices could be silenced or ignored. This pattern extended to how data was collected and preserved. Some experiments were meticulously documented with careful records of dosages, observations, and results. But in many cases, documentation was deliberately minimal. This served the security interests of the program, making it harder to trace specific experiments back to the CIA. but it also revealed a callous indifference to the subjects themselves. These were people whose experiences and suffering weren't considered important enough to record carefully. They were reduced to data points, to test cases, to expendable resources in a grand experiment. The scale and scope of MKUltra, spread across 149 sub-projects and dozens of institutions, created a kind of diffusion of responsibility. No single researcher was conducting all these experiments. No single institution was responsible for the entire program. Each person involved could tell themselves they were just playing a small part, conducting a limited study, following orders, or honoring a contract. But collectively they created a vast apparatus of human experimentation that violated the rights and dignity of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people. The distribution of the program across so many sites and sub-projects made it easier for individuals to avoid confronting the full moral weight of what was being done. And it made it far more difficult years later when investigators tried to piece together what had happened, to achieve anything like a complete accounting. Among the vast array of techniques and substances explored under MKUltra, one compound came to dominate the program's research efforts. LSD became one of MKUltra's primary tools, the subject of intense interest in countless experiments. Lysergic acid diethylamide had been synthesized in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, but its psychoactive properties weren't discovered until 5 years later when Hofmann accidentally absorbed some through his skin. The experience he described was profound and disorienting, a journey into altered consciousness unlike anything previously documented in scientific literature. By the early 1950s, when MKUltra was being established, LSD was still a relatively new and poorly understood substance. Some psychiatrists were exploring its potential therapeutic applications, believing it might help patients access repressed memories or break through psychological barriers. But within the CIA, interest in LSD took a very different direction. The agency saw potential not for healing, but for control, not for therapy, but for weaponization. The CIA believed LSD could dissolve resistance in ways that traditional interrogation methods could not. The reasoning was straightforward, if ultimately flawed. Under the influence of LSD, a person's normal psychological defenses seemed to collapse. The boundaries between self and other became fluid. Reality itself became negotiable. If LSD could break down a person's sense of self and reality, the thinking went, perhaps it could also break down their loyalty, their secrets, their ability to resist interrogation. Perhaps someone who had refused to cooperate while sober would become pliable and suggestible under the drug's influence. This theory drove an enormous investment in LSD research. The CIA acquired massive quantities of the drug, far more than any legitimate research institution would need. At one point, the agency had standing orders with pharmaceutical companies to purchase the entire world's supply of LSD, ensuring that no other nation could stockpile it. Sidney Gottlieb himself became deeply involved in LSD experimentation, both as an administrator and, notoriously, as an experimenter who tested the drug on colleagues without their knowledge. The experiments conducted with LSD violated every principle of ethical research. Subjects were given LSD without their knowledge in countless instances. This wasn't an occasional lapse or an isolated incident. It was standard practice across numerous MKUltra sub-projects. The logic, such as it was, held that only by observing subjects who had no idea they'd been drugged could researchers understand how the drug might be used operationally. If a subject knew they'd been given LSD, they might attribute their altered perceptions to the drug rather than believing they were going insane or having some kind of breakdown. And it was precisely that state of confusion and terror that the researchers wanted to study. The settings for these unwitting administrations varied. In some cases, CIA officers dosed each other at office parties or social gatherings, watching as colleagues descended into terrifying psychedelic experiences without understanding why. In Operation Midnight Climax, prostitutes working for the CIA gave LSD to clients in agency-run safe houses, while operatives observed from behind two-way mirrors. In university settings, researchers gave the drug to students or volunteers who thought they were participating in studies of something else entirely. In hospitals and mental institutions, patients received LSD without informed consent, often without even being told afterward what had been done to them. The doses used in these experiments were often far higher than therapeutic levels. In legitimate psychiatric research with LSD, doses were carefully calibrated, typically measured in micrograms and rarely exceeding 200 micrograms, even in clinical trials exploring the drug's effects. But in MKUltra experiments, researchers showed no such restraint. Subjects were sometimes given doses several times higher than what would be used therapeutically. The goal wasn't to explore consciousness or facilitate therapy. It was to overwhelm, to break down, to see what happened when the drug was pushed to its extremes. These massive doses produced experiences that went far beyond the mystical or introspective states sometimes associated with psychedelic drugs. At high doses, LSD could produce complete dissociation from reality, terrifying hallucinations, a total breakdown of the ability to distinguish self from environment. For someone who didn't know they'd been drugged, who had no framework for understanding what was happening to them, the experience could be absolutely devastating. Some subjects became convinced they were dying or going permanently insane. Others experienced such profound terror that it left lasting psychological scars. Even more disturbing, some subjects were dosed repeatedly over long periods. This wasn't a single unwitting administration followed by observation. Some MKUltra experiments involved giving subjects LSD day after day, sometimes for weeks at a time. At the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, some inmates were kept on LSD for more than 70 consecutive days. The researchers wanted to see whether the drug's effects changed with constant exposure, whether tolerance developed, whether extended use produced permanent alterations in consciousness or behavior. The rationale for these extended experiments was that if LSD was to be useful as an operational tool, the CIA needed to understand its effects under sustained use. But the human cost of acquiring this knowledge was enormous. Subjects endured weeks of altered consciousness, unable to trust their own perceptions, struggling to maintain any sense of stable reality. The psychological strain was immense, and the lack of informed consent meant these individuals had no ability to prepare themselves mentally or to withdraw if the experience became unbearable. LSD was central to MKUltra, but it was far from the only substance investigated. Other psychedelics included mescaline and psilocybin, each with their own distinct effects on consciousness and perception. Mescaline, derived from the peyote cactus, had been used for centuries in indigenous religious ceremonies, but MKUltra researchers cared nothing for its traditional context. They wanted to know whether it could induce suggestibility, whether it could break down resistance to interrogation. Psilocybin, the active compound in certain mushrooms, was similarly studied for its potential intelligence applications. The research extended beyond psychedelics. Barbiturates and amphetamines were also extensively tested. Barbiturates, sometimes called truth serums, were sedatives that could produce a state of drowsiness and reduced inhibition. Drugs like sodium pentothal had been used by psychiatrists and, controversially, by intelligence services, based on the theory that sedated subjects might be less able to maintain deceptions. MKUltra researchers conducted numerous experiments with barbiturates, often in combination with other techniques like isolation or psychological pressure, trying to find the optimal conditions for extracting information. Amphetamines represented the other end of the spectrum, stimulants that could keep subjects awake and alert for extended periods. The CIA was interested in whether sleep deprivation combined with stimulants might break down resistance or make subjects more vulnerable to interrogation. They studied various amphetamine compounds, testing different doses and durations, observing how subjects responded to being kept in heightened states of alertness for days at a time. What made the MKUltra drug experiments especially dangerous was that drug combinations were used unpredictably. Researchers didn't just test one substance at a time under controlled conditions. They mixed drugs, often without any scientific basis for predicting how the compounds would interact. A subject might be given LSD combined with amphetamines, or barbiturates followed by mescaline, or any number of other combinations. The interactions between these substances were poorly understood even by experts, and the MKUltra researchers often seemed more interested in observing unexpected effects than in following any systematic methodology. These unpredictable combinations multiplied the risks exponentially. The effects of LSD alone can be powerful and disorienting. Combined with stimulants, the experience might become even more intense and manic. Mixed with depressants, the results could be entirely different. Some combinations potentiated each other, amplifying effects far beyond what either drug would produce alone. Other combinations created unique and sometimes dangerous physiological responses. The subjects of these experiments were essentially human laboratories for exploring untested and potentially lethal drug interactions. The effects these substances produced were severe and often terrifying. Paranoia was common, a sense that everyone was watching, that conspiracies were everywhere, that danger lurked around every corner. For someone who didn't know they'd been drugged, this paranoia had no obvious cause, which made it even more disturbing. They couldn't rationalize it away as a drug effect. It felt absolutely real, an insight into a threatening reality that had always been there but which they were only now perceiving. Hallucinations were frequent, ranging from subtle distortions of perception to full-blown visions that completely overrode sensory reality. Visual hallucinations might include geometric patterns, distortions of faces or objects, or entirely fabricated scenes. Auditory hallucinations could involve hearing voices, music, or sounds that had no external source. For some subjects, these hallucinations were mildly interesting or even pleasurable. But for many, especially those who didn't know they'd been drugged, hallucinations were a source of profound terror and confusion. In some cases, the drug experiences triggered acute psychosis, a complete break with reality. Subjects might develop delusional beliefs, becoming convinced of things that had no basis in fact. They might exhibit disorganized thinking and behavior, unable to maintain coherent thoughts or responses. They might experience severe emotional disturbances, swinging between euphoria and despair, between calmness and violent agitation. These psychotic episodes could last hours or days, and in some cases they didn't fully resolve even after the drug had cleared from the system. Perhaps most tragic, some psychological damage was permanent. The human mind is remarkably resilient, and many people who underwent MKUltra drug experiments eventually recovered, though often only after significant suffering and treatment. But not everyone was so fortunate. Some subjects emerged from the experiments with lasting psychological problems. They might develop chronic anxiety or depression. They might experience recurring flashbacks to traumatic drug experiences. They might struggle with persistent paranoia or difficulty trusting their own perceptions. In the most severe cases, subjects experienced complete personality changes or permanent cognitive impairment. There are documented instances of people who, before their involvement in MKUltra experiments, had been functional and healthy, but who afterward were unable to work, unable to maintain relationships, unable to live independently. Some required institutionalization. Some never recovered a stable sense of self. The chemicals that the CIA administered in pursuit of operational intelligence tools destroyed lives, and the damage couldn't be undone. One of the most infamous casualties of MKUltra's LSD experiments was Frank Olson, a biochemist who worked for the Army's Special Operations Division. In November 1953, Olson attended a work retreat where Sidney Gottlieb spiked the after-dinner drinks with LSD, dosing Olson and several colleagues without their knowledge. Olson had a severe reaction, becoming deeply disturbed and paranoid. Over the following days, his mental state deteriorated. The CIA arranged for him to see a psychiatrist in New York, but on November 28th, Olson fell to his death from a hotel room window. For more than 20 years, his death was officially listed as a suicide, and his family was told only that he had jumped from a window while suffering from mental problems. The truth about his unwitting dosing and the CIA's involvement only emerged decades later. Olson's case illustrates both the immediate dangers of the drug experiments and the broader culture of secrecy and callousness that characterized MKUltra. A man was given a powerful psychedelic drug without his knowledge, suffered a severe psychological crisis as a result, and ended up dead. And rather than acknowledging what had happened or accepting responsibility, the CIA covered it up, allowing Olson's family to believe for decades that his death was simply a tragic suicide, unconnected to his work. It was only through persistent investigation and eventual government disclosure that anything approaching the truth came to light. The drug experiments represented MKUltra at perhaps its most reckless and harmful. The researchers were dealing with powerful substances that they only partially understood, administering them in uncontrolled conditions to unwitting subjects, using doses and combinations that no ethical review board would ever approve. They justified this with appeals to national security and the need to stay ahead of enemy advances. But the reality was that they were conducting human experiments that differed only in degree, not in kind, from the ones that had horrified the world when revealed at Nuremberg just a few years earlier. The difference was that these experiments were being conducted by the United States, classified as state secrets and hidden from any accountability. While drugs captured much of MKUltra's attention and resources, the program's architects understood that chemical approaches alone wouldn't provide all the answers they sought. The human mind could be attacked through multiple avenues, and MKUltra researchers explored every method they could imagine for breaking down psychological resistance and establishing control. These techniques ranged from the seemingly scientific to the overtly brutal, but they shared a common goal: to find the breaking points of human consciousness and exploit them. Hypnosis was studied as a control mechanism throughout MKUltra's existence. The concept of hypnotic control had long fascinated both the public and intelligence services. Could a person be hypnotized and then commanded to perform actions they would normally refuse? Could hypnosis be used to extract secrets from unwilling subjects? Could it create programmable agents who would carry out orders without conscious awareness? These questions drove extensive research within the program. The CIA recruited hypnotists and funded research at multiple universities to explore hypnosis in ways that legitimate practitioners would never attempt. Researchers tried to determine whether hypnotized subjects could be compelled to harm themselves or others, whether they could be made to forget they had been hypnotized, whether post-hypnotic suggestions could override a person's moral convictions or sense of self-preservation. The experiments pushed subjects into deep trance states and tested the limits of hypnotic influence. Some of the hypnosis research focused specifically on whether the technique could be combined with drugs to enhance suggestibility. Subjects might be given barbiturates or other sedatives and then subjected to hypnotic induction, with researchers theorizing that the chemical lowering of inhibitions would make hypnotic control more complete. Other experiments explored whether LSD-induced altered states made subjects more susceptible to hypnotic commands. The goal was always operational utility, finding methods that could be deployed in the field against intelligence targets. Closely related to the hypnosis research were attempts to induce amnesia. If the CIA could selectively erase memories, the applications seemed limitless. An agent could be made to forget classified information if captured. A subject could be interrogated and then have all memory of the interrogation removed. Someone who had witnessed a covert operation could be made to forget what they'd seen. Researchers worked systematically to find reliable methods for creating memory gaps. The approaches varied considerably. Some researchers used electroshock therapy, administering jolts of electricity to the brain in an attempt to disrupt memory formation or storage. Others combined drugs with hypnotic suggestion, trying to convince subjects under the influence of sedatives that certain events had never happened. Still, others explored extreme psychological stress, based on theories that traumatic experiences could create dissociative states where memories failed to form properly or became inaccessible. The amnesia research had limited success, at least in terms of creating selective, controllable memory loss. The brain proved far more complex and resilient than the researchers had hoped, but the experiments did produce memory impairment in many subjects, even if not in the precise, targeted way the CIA wanted. People emerged from these experiments with gaps in their memory, with confusion about their own past, with an inability to recall portions of their lives. The damage was real, even if it wasn't quite the surgical precision the program had sought. Even more ambitious were experiments that explored memory implantation. If memories could be erased, could false memories be inserted in their place? Could researchers convince someone that events which never happened had actually occurred? Could they create entirely fabricated memories that the subject would believe with complete conviction? This research represented an attempt to rewrite personal history, to fundamentally alter someone's understanding of their own life and experiences. The techniques for attempting memory implantation drew on everything else MKUltra was exploring. Subjects might be kept in sensory deprivation while being fed false narratives through speakers. They might be given drugs that increased suggestibility and then told detailed stories about events that had never occurred. They might be shown fabricated photographs or documents purporting to prove that the false memories were real. Hypnosis might be used to deepen the implantation, to make the false memories feel more vivid and authentic. The results of these memory implantation experiments were mixed at best. Creating completely false memories that could withstand scrutiny proved extraordinarily difficult, but the research did demonstrate that memory is far more malleable than people generally assume. Under the right conditions of stress, suggestion, and manipulation, subjects could be made to doubt their own recollections, to accept that their memories were unreliable, to incorporate elements of false narratives into their understanding of the past. Sensory deprivation was widely used across numerous MKUltra sub-projects. The technique involved removing as much external stimulation as possible, creating an environment where subjects had minimal sensory input. The theoretical basis was that without normal sensory feedback, the mind would become more vulnerable to suggestion, more desperate for any kind of stimulation or contact, more willing to accept ideas or information that provided some relief from the emptiness. The methods of sensory deprivation varied in their sophistication but shared common elements. Subjects were isolated for extended periods in specially designed rooms or chambers. These environments might be soundproofed to eliminate auditory input. Lighting was often reduced to complete darkness or maintained at constant, unchanging levels to eliminate visual variation. Temperature was controlled to remove even the sensation of environmental change. In some experiments, subjects wore goggles that admitted only diffuse light, eliminating the ability to see shapes or objects. Gloves or other coverings reduced tactile sensation. The psychological effects of sensory deprivation emerged quickly and grew more severe with time. Within hours, many subjects began to experience anxiety and disorientation. They lost track of time, unable to tell whether minutes or hours had passed. Their thoughts became scattered and disorganized. Some began to hallucinate, their brains apparently generating sensory experiences in the absence of actual stimuli. Visual hallucinations might include patterns of light or shadow, faces appearing in the darkness, entire scenes playing out like waking dreams. As isolation continued, the effects intensified. Subjects might begin to question their own sanity. They might develop intense emotional reactions, swinging between terror and apathy. Their sense of self could begin to fragment as the normal anchors of identity provided by interaction with the environment and other people were stripped away. Some subjects became highly suggestible, grateful for any human contact, and willing to agree with almost anything to end the isolation. The extended nature of some sensory deprivation experiments crossed into territory that can only be described as torture. Subjects were isolated for days, sometimes weeks, with minimal human contact and virtually no sensory stimulation. The suffering this caused was documented in the researchers' own notes, even as they continued the experiments. Subjects begged to be released, exhibited signs of severe psychological distress, and in some cases experienced mental breakdowns that persisted long after the isolation ended. Sleep deprivation lasted days in some cases, representing another assault on basic human functioning. Sleep is a fundamental biological necessity, and preventing it produces severe and predictable effects. MKUltra researchers knew this and systematically explored how sleep deprivation could be used to break down resistance and create vulnerability. Subjects were kept awake through various means: loud noises, bright lights, physical prodding, administration of stimulants, or simply constant monitoring that prevented them from sleeping. After 24 hours without sleep, cognitive function begins to deteriorate noticeably. Attention and concentration suffer. Irritability increases. After 48 hours, the effects become more severe. Hallucinations may begin. Paranoia can develop. Emotional regulation fails. By the time subjects had been kept awake for 3 or 4 days, they were often in states of profound psychological distress, experiencing reality in deeply distorted ways, desperate for sleep, and highly vulnerable to manipulation. Sleep deprivation was rarely used in isolation. It was typically combined with other techniques: sensory deprivation, stress positions, interrogation, drug administration. The cumulative effect of these combined stressors was to create complete psychological overwhelming. A subject who was sleep-deprived, isolated, confused by drugs, and subjected to intense questioning had little capacity for resistance. They became desperate for the torture to end, willing to say or do almost anything for relief. The psychological techniques extended beyond these environmental manipulations. Verbal abuse and intimidation were used deliberately as tools for breaking down subjects. This wasn't incidental cruelty or loss of temper. It was a calculated strategy based on theories about how psychological dominance could be established and maintained. Researchers and interrogators subjected participants to sustained verbal attacks, insults, threats, and degradation designed to destroy self-esteem and create a state of learned helplessness. The verbal abuse often targeted core aspects of a subject's identity. Researchers attacked their intelligence, their worth as human beings, their relationships, their most cherished beliefs. The goal was to create profound self-doubt, to make subjects question everything they thought they knew about themselves. Combined with the disorientation caused by drugs or sensory deprivation, this verbal assault could be devastating. Subjects lost confidence in their own perceptions and judgments, making them more dependent on their captors for any sense of reality or direction. In some experiments, sexual humiliation was employed as a stressor. This represents perhaps the most deliberately cruel aspect of MKUltra's methodology. Researchers subjected participants to scenarios designed to produce shame and degradation around sexuality and bodily functions. The specific methods varied, but the intent was always to attack the subject at their most vulnerable, to create associations between shame, fear, and submission that could be exploited. The use of sexual humiliation wasn't justified by any legitimate research rationale. It was pure exploitation of power and vulnerability. But within the logic of MKUltra, it was simply another technique to be tested, another way of breaking down psychological resistance. The researchers documented these methods clinically, treating the profound violation of human dignity as just another data point in their quest for control mechanisms. Electroshock therapy was administered in some experiments, though calling it therapy is itself a misuse of the term. In legitimate psychiatric practice, electroconvulsive therapy is sometimes used as a treatment for severe depression or other conditions, administered under controlled conditions with appropriate safeguards. In MKUltra experiments, electroshock became a tool for inducing memory loss, creating confusion, and breaking down personality structures. The most notorious use of electroshock occurred in experiments conducted by Dr. Ewan Cameron at McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute. Cameron administered electroshock at intensities and frequencies far beyond any therapeutic protocol. He gave patients multiple sessions per day, sometimes combining electroshock with drug-induced comas and sensory deprivation. His stated goal was to depattern the mind, to erase existing thought patterns and personality structures so they could be rebuilt from scratch. In practice, he destroyed aspects of his patients' memories and identities, leaving them with profound cognitive impairment. Patients who underwent Cameron's electroshock experiments often emerged unable to remember significant portions of their lives. Some couldn't recognize family members. Others lost basic skills and knowledge they had possessed before treatment. The damage was often permanent, robbing people of their memories, their sense of continuity with their own past, their fundamental sense of who they were. And these were patients who had come to Cameron seeking help, who trusted him as a respected psychiatrist, who had no idea their treatment was funded by the CIA as part of intelligence research. Throughout all these experiments, psychological breakdown was considered useful data. This fundamental orientation characterized MKUltra's approach. When subjects experienced severe distress, when they lost their grip on reality, when they begged for the experiments to stop, the researchers didn't see human suffering that should give them pause. They saw evidence that their techniques were working, that they had found effective methods for overwhelming psychological defenses. The documentation from MKUltra experiments is full of clinical descriptions of people in extreme distress. Subjects crying uncontrollably, exhibiting signs of psychosis, expressing suicidal thoughts, displaying symptoms of severe trauma. And these observations are recorded matter-of-factly, analyzed for what they reveal about the effectiveness of various techniques. The human beings experiencing this suffering are rendered as subjects, as data points, as test cases. Their pain is instrumentalized, treated as useful information rather than as a moral emergency requiring the experiments to stop. This dehumanization was essential to MKUltra's operation. It would have been impossible to conduct these experiments while maintaining full awareness of the subjects as people with lives, families, hopes, and inherent dignity. So the program created distance, both literally through the use of unwitting subjects who would never know what had been done to them, and psychologically through the language and framing of scientific research. The suffering was real, but it was recorded in passive voice, discussed in technical terms, analyzed for operational utility. The psychological techniques explored in MKUltra represented an attempt to industrialize cruelty, to make systematic and scientific what had previously been the province of torturers and sadists. The researchers believed they were advancing knowledge, serving their country, doing difficult but necessary work. But what they were actually doing was documenting in meticulous detail how to most effectively strip away human dignity, psychological stability, and sense of self. They created a blueprint for psychological torture, and though much of the research proved less operationally useful than hoped, the techniques themselves would echo through subsequent decades in interrogation practices and covert operations. Among the many sub-projects that comprised MKUltra, few illustrate the program's complete moral bankruptcy more clearly than a particular operation that began in the mid-1950s. A sub-program called Operation Midnight Climax was launched, and it represented a descent into methods that went beyond even the already compromised ethics that characterized the broader program. What made Midnight Climax particularly disturbing wasn't just the techniques employed, but the casual, almost cavalier way in which the operation violated the rights and dignity of unwitting American citizens. The operation was conceived and initially run by George Hunter White, a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent who had been recruited by the CIA to work on MKUltra projects. White was not a scientist or a researcher in any conventional sense. His background was in law enforcement and undercover work, often in the world of drug trafficking and organized crime. He was known for his willingness to bend or break rules, for his comfort with deception, and for a certain swagger about his work that suggested he enjoyed the covert nature of what he did. He was, in many ways, the perfect person to run an operation that would require both operational security and a lack of moral squeamishness. The basic architecture of Operation Midnight Climax was straightforward in concept, even as it was shocking in execution. CIA safe houses were established in San Francisco and New York, apartments that appeared from the outside to be ordinary residences but which had been specifically configured for surveillance and experimentation. The San Francisco location, on Telegraph Hill, was decorated in an odd style that White apparently found amusing: red curtains, photographs of nude women, an environment that suggested a place of illicit pleasure rather than a government research facility. But the decoration was superficial. What mattered was the infrastructure. The apartments were equipped with one-way mirrors that allowed observers to watch what happened in the main rooms without being seen. Recording equipment captured audio and, in some cases, video of what transpired. The spaces were designed to be inviting and disarming, places where men would feel comfortable and unsuspecting. Everything about the setup was calculated to create an environment where subjects would be vulnerable and observed without their knowledge. To bring subjects into these locations, prostitutes were hired to lure men to these locations. The CIA recruited women who worked in the sex trade, compensating them for their cooperation and, in some cases, overlooking their legal vulnerabilities related to prostitution. These women were instructed to approach men in bars or on the street, to engage them in conversation, and to bring them back to the safe houses. The premise offered to the men would be exactly what it appeared to be, the promise of sexual activity with these women. The prostitutes recruited for this operation were placed in a complex moral position. They were being paid by the government to facilitate what amounted to experiments on unwitting subjects. Some may have understood the full scope of what was happening. Others may have been told only that they were helping with law enforcement or intelligence work, with the details deliberately obscured. Either way, they became instruments of the program, essential to its operation, even as they themselves occupied a vulnerable position in society that the CIA was exploiting. Once men arrived at the safe houses, the core of the experiment would begin. Subjects were secretly dosed with LSD, typically by having it slipped into drinks. The men had come to these locations expecting an illicit but consensual encounter with a prostitute. They had no idea they were walking into a CIA experiment. They had no idea that within minutes of accepting a drink, they would be under the influence of one of the most powerful psychoactive substances known to science. They had no idea they were being watched. The dosing was done surreptitiously. A drink would be prepared and handed to the subject. The LSD would already be in it, colorless and tasteless, completely undetectable. The man would drink, perhaps making conversation, perhaps negotiating the terms of the encounter, completely unaware that his perception of reality was about to be profoundly altered. Within 20 or 30 minutes, the drug would begin to take effect. Colors might become more vivid, perceptions might start to warp, the boundaries of self might begin to blur. As the drug took hold, CIA agents observed through one-way mirrors. They watched as men began to experience the effects of LSD in a situation that was already charged with sexual tension and the psychological complexity of an illicit encounter. The agents took notes, documenting behaviors, reactions, statements. They were studying how people responded when drugs, sexuality, and deception were combined. They were observing vulnerability in its most intimate form, and they were doing so from behind glass, unseen and uninvolved, except as watchers and recorders. The choice to use sexual activity to study vulnerability was deliberate. The CIA believed that moments of sexual intimacy represented times when people's psychological defenses were lowered, when they were physically and emotionally exposed. If LSD dissolved mental barriers and sexual activity created a state of vulnerability, then combining the two might create optimal conditions for observing how people behaved when completely unguarded. The logic was clinical, but the reality was the deliberate exploitation of intimate human experiences for intelligence purposes. The men who came to these safe houses had consented to sex with prostitutes. What they had not consented to was being drugged, observed, and studied. The sexual encounters that took place were occurring under fundamentally false pretenses. The men believed they were in private moments with the women. In reality, they were being watched by CIA operatives. Their most intimate behaviors were being documented, their drug-induced reactions recorded, their vulnerability cataloged as research data. In many experiments, alcohol was often combined with drugs to compound the effects. The men would typically be drinking already when they arrived or shortly after. Alcohol lowers inhibitions on its own, and combined with LSD, the effects could be particularly disorienting. The researchers wanted to see how these substances interacted, how someone who was both intoxicated and under the influence of a powerful psychedelic would behave in a sexual situation. It was another layer of manipulation, another variable in the experiment, another way to push subjects into states where their normal judgment and self-control were compromised. The combination of alcohol and LSD could produce severe impairment. Someone might become completely disoriented, unable to understand what was happening to them. They might experience terrifying hallucinations or paranoid delusions while also being physically impaired by alcohol. The lack of coordination and judgment caused by drinking, combined with the perceptual distortions caused by LSD, could leave subjects in states of profound confusion and distress. And all of this was happening in an environment where they believed they were simply having a paid sexual encounter. None of the men brought to these safe houses ever consented to what was done to them. Consent requires knowledge, and these subjects had no knowledge of the true nature of their situation. They thought they were engaging in one kind of transaction when they were actually being subjected to something completely different. This wasn't a case of inadequate informed consent or a technical violation of research ethics. It was the complete absence of consent, the deliberate choice to conduct experiments on people who had no idea they were subjects. The absence of consent extended beyond the immediate experience. Subjects were never informed afterward about what had been done to them. When the encounter ended and the men left the safe houses, they had no idea they had been part of a CIA experiment. If they felt strange, if they had disturbing experiences, they had no framework for understanding why. They might attribute their altered perceptions to having had too much to drink, or to stress, or to some kind of psychological breakdown. They might seek medical help for symptoms they couldn't explain, but they would never know that they had been deliberately dosed with LSD and observed by intelligence agents. This lack of follow-up or disclosure meant that subjects couldn't seek appropriate care if they experienced lasting effects. If someone had a severe reaction, if they developed persistent anxiety or paranoia or flashbacks, they had no way to connect those symptoms to the drug they had unknowingly been given. Medical professionals they might consult would be working without crucial information, unable to provide appropriate treatment because they didn't know what had actually caused the patient's symptoms. The CIA's secrecy extended to a complete disregard for the welfare of subjects once the immediate experiment ended. What makes Operation Midnight Climax even more troubling is that these operations were documented casually by handlers. Reading the reports and notes from this operation, one is struck by the tone. There's no sense of moral struggle, no indication that anyone involved felt they were crossing serious ethical lines. George Hunter White kept a diary of his work, and the entries treat the experiments as just another aspect of his intelligence work, no different from any other undercover operation. There are notes about which subjects exhibited which behaviors, observations about how the drugs affected sexual performance, comments about the logistics of running the safe houses. The casual documentation suggests a complete normalization of what was happening. This wasn't seen as an extraordinary violation that required special justification. It was simply work, documented in the same matter-of-fact way one might document any other project. The agents observing through the mirrors were recording data. The administrators reviewing the reports were evaluating whether the operation was yielding useful intelligence. The entire apparatus treated the violation of these men's rights and dignity as routine, as just another day in the secret world of intelligence operations. White himself seemed to take a certain perverse pride in the work. His correspondence and diary entries suggest someone who enjoyed the deceptive aspects of the operation, who found something amusing or satisfying in the entire setup. There's a cynicism evident in how he wrote about the work, a sense that he saw himself as operating beyond normal moral constraints, in a realm where the usual rules didn't apply. This attitude wasn't unique to White. It reflected the broader culture of MKUltra, where secrecy and national security rationales created spaces where people could convince themselves that nothing they did required the normal ethical considerations. Operation Midnight Climax ran for nearly a decade. From the mid-1950s into the early 1960s, These safe houses operated, bringing in subject after subject, dosing them, observing them, documenting the results. Dozens of men, possibly hundreds over the years, were subjected to these experiments without their knowledge. Each one represented a violation of informed consent, a betrayal of trust, an exploitation of vulnerability for intelligence purposes. The operation eventually ended not because of ethical concerns but because of practical considerations. George Hunter White retired, and without his particular combination of law enforcement connections and willingness to run such an operation, it became harder to sustain. Moreover, by the early 1960s, the CIA was becoming increasingly aware that LSD might not be the wonder drug they had hoped. The results from years of experiments were mixed at best. The drug produced profound effects, certainly, but not the kind of predictable, controllable responses that would make it useful for operational purposes. When Operation Midnight Climax finally shut down, the safe houses were closed and the prostitutes were no longer needed. The equipment was removed, the files were archived in secure CIA storage, and the operation became another classified project buried in the agency's secret history. The men who had been subjects never learned what had happened to them. The women who had been recruited as Confederates in the operation returned to their lives, bound by whatever secrecy agreements or implied threats kept them from speaking about what they had participated in. Looking back at Operation Midnight Climax, it's difficult to find anything that redeems it or justifies it, even by the skewed logic of Cold War intelligence work. It produced little actionable intelligence. It didn't lead to breakthroughs in interrogation techniques or behavioral control. What it did do was violate the rights of numerous American citizens, subject them to experiments without consent, and document their most intimate moments for purposes they would have found abhorrent had they known about them. The operation stands as a particularly stark example of how far MKUltra was willing to go. If the broader program represented a systematic erosion of ethical boundaries in the name of national security, Operation Midnight Climax represented the end point of that erosion, a complete disregard for human dignity, for consent, for basic moral principles. It was intelligence work stripped of any pretense of serving a higher purpose, reduced to its most cynical and exploitative essence. And it was all done under the authority of the United States government, funded by taxpayer dollars, protected by classification systems that ensured the truth wouldn't emerge for decades. If Operation Midnight Climax illustrated MKUltra's systematic exploitation of the vulnerable, another incident revealed something perhaps even more chilling: the program's willingness to sacrifice its own. The case of Frank Olson would become one of the most notorious and controversial episodes in MKUltra's history, a death that raised questions that remain unresolved more than 70 years later. It demonstrated that the program's recklessness extended even to those within the government's own ranks, and that the culture of secrecy surrounding MKUltra would lead to decades of deception and cover-up. Frank Olson was a U.S. Army scientist who worked at Fort Detrick in Maryland, the military's Center for Biological Warfare Research. He was a bacteriologist employed by the Army's Special Operations Division, a unit that developed methods for disseminating biological agents and studied ways to defend against such weapons. Olson was 43 years old in 1953, married with 3 children. By all accounts, he was a dedicated scientist and a conscientious family man. His work was classified, and he took the secrecy requirements seriously. He had access to some of the most sensitive military research programs of the Cold War era. Olson's work brought him into contact with the CIA's Technical Services Staff, the division that ran MKUltra. There was significant overlap between biological warfare research and the CIA's interest in incapacitating agents and interrogation drugs. Scientists like Olson, with expertise in how substances affected human biology, were valuable consultants for MKUltra projects. It was this connection that would prove fatal. In November of 1953, Olson attended what was described as a working retreat at a lodge in western Maryland. The gathering brought together CIA personnel and Army scientists for discussions about ongoing research collaborations. The retreat was organized by Sidney Gottlieb, MKUltra's director, and among those present was a mixture of biochemists, intelligence officers, and military researchers. It seemed, on the surface, like a routine meeting of people working on classified projects, an opportunity to share information and coordinate efforts away from the office environment. The dosing occurred during a CIA retreat on November 19th. That evening, after dinner, Gottlieb spiked a bottle of Cointreau with LSD and served drinks to the assembled group. Several people, including Olson, consumed the drugged liqueur. Approximately 20 minutes later, after the drug would have begun taking effect, Gottlieb informed the group that they had been given LSD. This revelation itself was part of the experiment. The CIA wanted to observe how people reacted when they learned they had been unwittingly dosed with a powerful psychedelic. For most of those present, the experience was apparently manageable, if unsettling. These were people who, to varying degrees, knew about the CIA's drug research. They could contextualize what was happening to them, understand that the strange sensations and altered perceptions were drug-induced. But Olson's reaction was different and far more severe. From the beginning, he appeared to experience the drug not as an interesting psychological phenomenon, but as a profound crisis. Something about the experience, or perhaps something about learning he had been deceived and drugged by colleagues, deeply disturbed him. Olson experienced severe psychological distress afterward. In the days following the retreat, his behavior changed dramatically. His wife, Alice, noticed immediately that something was wrong. Her husband seemed anxious and preoccupied, unlike his normally calm demeanor. He had trouble sleeping. He seemed troubled by something he wouldn't or couldn't articulate. To those who worked with him, Olson appeared to be struggling with some internal conflict, wrestling with thoughts he couldn't share. He became paranoid and emotionally unstable. Olson began expressing fears that something terrible was going to happen to him. He talked about having made mistakes at work, though he wouldn't specify what those mistakes were. He seemed to believe that he was in danger, that people were watching him, that he had done something wrong that would have serious consequences. His colleagues and family didn't know what to make of these fears. They seemed out of proportion to anything in Olson's actual circumstances, but they were clearly very real to him. The paranoia may have been purely a result of the LSD, a drug-induced psychological break. But some who have studied the case suggest that Olson may have been grappling with moral concerns about the work he was involved in. In the period before the retreat, Olson had traveled to Europe and witnessed interrogations that involved extreme methods. He may have been troubled by what he saw, by the applications of biological and chemical research to purposes that disturbed him ethically. The LSD experience might have broken down his ability to compartmentalize these concerns, bringing moral questions to the surface in a way that his training and discipline had previously suppressed. Recognizing that Olson was in psychological crisis, the CIA arranged for him to see a psychiatrist in New York. The psychiatrist chosen was Dr. Harold Abramson, who was himself involved in MKUltra research and had conducted LSD experiments for the CIA. Olson was accompanied to New York by a CIA officer named Robert Lashbrook, ostensibly to ensure he received care, but also, almost certainly, to monitor him and maintain operational security. They checked into the Statler Hotel in Manhattan on November 24th. The psychiatric consultation apparently did little to help. Olson remained distressed, and according to Lashbrook's later accounts, his condition seemed to worsen. Plans were made to admit him to a facility where he could receive more intensive treatment. But those plans would never be carried out. In the early morning hours of November 28th, just 9 days after being dosed with LSD, tragedy struck. Days later, he fell from a hotel window. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, Frank Olson went through the closed window of his 10th-floor hotel room and fell to the street below. Robert Lashbrook, who was sharing the room with him, would later say he was awakened by the sound of breaking glass and saw Olson going through the window. Olson landed on the sidewalk and was still alive when the first police officers arrived, but he died shortly after from his injuries. The fall from 10 stories was not survivable. His death was ruled a suicide. The New York City medical examiner concluded that Olson had deliberately thrown himself through the window. The police investigation was brief and accepted this conclusion. The official narrative was that Frank Olson, suffering from depression and mental instability, had taken his own life. The broken window, the time of night, Lashbrook's account of events, all seemed consistent with suicide. The case was closed. But the truth of what happened was far more complex and disturbing than the official story suggested. The CIA concealed the LSD dosing from his family. When Alice Olson was informed of her husband's death, she was told only that he had been suffering from mental problems and had jumped from a hotel window. There was no mention of LSD, no explanation of the retreat, no disclosure that her husband had been the subject of a CIA drug experiment. She was left to believe that her husband had simply suffered some kind of breakdown and killed himself. The CIA provided the Olson family with financial support, but it came with strings attached. The agency arranged for Alice to receive death benefits beyond what she would normally be entitled to, but she was required to sign documents that effectively prevented her from pursuing legal action. The money was presented as compassionate assistance for a widow and her children, but it was also hush money, intended to ensure that difficult questions weren't asked and that the circumstances of Frank Olson's death remained buried. For more than 2 decades, the Olson family believed the official story. They mourned a husband and father who had, for reasons they couldn't fully understand, taken his own life. They lived with questions about why it had happened, what signs they might have missed, what they could have done differently. And all the while, the CIA maintained its silence about the true circumstances that had led to Frank Olson's death. The truth began to emerge only in the mid-1970s, when congressional investigations into CIA activities started to uncover information about MKUltra. Years later, the government admitted involvement. In 1975, a presidential commission led by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller released a report that, while heavily redacted, mentioned that a civilian employee of the Department of the Army had died after being given LSD in a CIA experiment. Journalists quickly identified the employee as Frank Olson. The revelation was devastating for the Olson family. More than 20 years after Frank Olson's death, they learned that everything they had been told was incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. The mental breakdown that led to his suicide hadn't come from nowhere. It had been triggered by a CIA drug experiment conducted without his informed consent. The U.S. government had known this all along and had chosen to hide it from his family. In response to the public disclosure, President Gerald Ford personally apologized to the Olson family and invited them to the White House. The CIA director, William Colby, also met with the family and expressed regret. Congress passed a special bill authorizing payment of $750,000 to Alice Olson and her children as compensation. These gestures seem to acknowledge wrongdoing and provide some measure of closure. But for Eric Olson, Frank's son, the government's admissions raised as many questions as they answered. The official story now acknowledged the LSD dosing, but still maintained that Frank Olson had committed suicide. Eric Olson found this explanation increasingly unsatisfying. Why had his father been taken to New York rather than a local facility? Why had he been accompanied by a CIA officer rather than medical personnel? Why had so many details of the final days remained vague or contradictory? In the 1990s, Eric Olson had his father's body exhumed and subjected to a new forensic examination. A later autopsy suggested possible foul play. The forensic pathologist who examined the remains, Dr. James Stars, found evidence that was inconsistent with the suicide narrative. There was a hematoma on Olson's head that appeared to have occurred before the fall, suggesting he might have been struck. The pattern of injuries was, in Stars's professional opinion, more consistent with someone who had been unconscious or already dead when they went through the window, rather than someone who had jumped. These findings led Eric Olson and others to develop an alternative theory, that Frank Olson had been murdered. According to this hypothesis, Olson had become a security risk. Perhaps he had learned things during his trip to Europe that the CIA couldn't allow him to share. Perhaps his psychological crisis made him unpredictable, someone who might reveal classified information. Perhaps the decision was made that he needed to be silenced, and his death was staged to look like a suicide. In this version of events, the LSD dosing might have been intended to destabilize him from the beginning, or his reaction to it simply provided an opportunity. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but troubling. Documents that emerged in later years showed that the CIA had, in fact, developed assassination techniques that included making deaths appear accidental or self-inflicted. There were manuals describing how to arrange falls from windows or balconies to eliminate someone while minimizing suspicion. The fact that Robert Lashbrook, a CIA officer rather than a medical professional, was alone with Olson in that hotel room raised obvious questions about what might have happened in those early morning hours. Despite these suspicions and the forensic evidence suggesting foul play, no criminal charges were ever filed. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office reviewed the case in the 1990s following the new autopsy findings. They investigated whether there was sufficient evidence to charge anyone with Olson's death, but too much time had passed. Key witnesses had died. Physical evidence had been lost or destroyed. The hotel room where Olson died had long since been renovated. The investigators concluded that while the circumstances were suspicious, there wasn't enough evidence to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt or to identify a specific perpetrator. The legal obstacles to prosecution were compounded by classification issues. Much of what happened in the days leading up to Olson's death remained classified. Documents that might shed light on who knew what and when were withheld on national security grounds. Witnesses who might have relevant information were bound by secrecy oaths, and in some cases claimed they couldn't speak about certain matters without violating their obligations. The very system of secrecy that had allowed MKUltra to operate without oversight now prevented a full accounting of what had happened to one of its victims. The Olson case came to symbolize everything troubling about MKUltra. It showed how the program treated even its collaborators as expendable subjects. It demonstrated the lengths to which the CIA would go to protect its secrets, including deceiving the family of a man who had died under suspicious circumstances. It revealed how classification systems could be used to prevent accountability, ensuring that even when wrongdoing was acknowledged, the full truth remained hidden. And it illustrated how the effects of MKUltra extended far beyond the immediate victims, causing suffering that rippled through families and across generations. For Eric Olson, the quest to understand his father's death became a life's work. He spent decades investigating, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, interviewing people who had known his father, consulting with experts, challenging the official narrative. He never accepted that his father had simply committed suicide after a bad drug experience. He believed, based on years of research and reflection, that his father had been murdered to protect CIA secrets. Whether that belief is correct may never be definitively proven, but the very existence of such doubts speaks to the profound mistrust that MKUltra created. The Frank Olson case also highlighted a cruel irony. MKUltra was supposedly about protecting national security, about developing tools to use against enemies of the United States. But Frank Olson wasn't an enemy. He was a scientist working for the U.S. government on classified military research. If the program's defenders argued that extreme measures were justified to protect the country, what justification could possibly exist for dosing one of the country's own scientists with LSD and then potentially covering up the consequences when the experiment went horribly wrong? The case suggested that MKUltra had become unmoored from any legitimate security rationale, that it had become an end in itself, perpetuating its own secrecy and protecting its own operations regardless of the cost to individuals or to the principles the nation claimed to uphold. From its inception, MKUltra existed in tension with fundamental principles of American law and ethics. This wasn't a matter of good intentions gone astray or unforeseen consequences of legitimate research. MKUltra violated U.S. laws and ethical norms in ways that were clear and unambiguous from the beginning. The program's architects knew they were crossing lines, and they proceeded anyway, sheltered by secrecy and emboldened by their conviction that national security justified whatever measures they deemed necessary. The legal violations were numerous and serious. Federal law prohibited experimentation on human subjects without their informed consent, a principle that had been established in response to the horrors revealed during the Nazi medical trials. The National Research Act and subsequent regulations required that research involving human subjects undergo review by institutional boards designed to protect participant welfare. While some of these specific regulations were formalized after MKUltra's peak years, the underlying principles they codified were already recognized in medical and scientific communities as binding ethical obligations. MKUltra systematically ignored these requirements. The unwitting administration of drugs violated laws against assault. The observation of people without their knowledge in private settings violated privacy laws. The use of coercion and deception in research contexts violated federal regulations governing scientific studies. When researchers associated with MKUltra published findings in academic journals without disclosing the CIA's involvement or the true nature of the experiments, they engaged in scientific fraud. When the agency funneled money through front organizations to conceal the source of funding, they potentially violated financial regulations and tax laws. Beyond domestic law, MKUltra violated principles later codified in the Nuremberg Code, the set of ethical guidelines established in 1947 following the prosecution of Nazi doctors who had conducted grotesque experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The Nuremberg Code established clear standards for human experimentation. It required voluntary consent from subjects who were fully informed about the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment. It required that experiments be designed to minimize suffering and avoid unnecessary physical and mental injury. It required that experiments only be conducted when the expected results justified the risks. MKUltra violated virtually every principle of the Nuremberg Code. Subjects didn't provide voluntary consent. In many cases, they didn't even know they were subjects. They weren't informed about the nature or purpose of what was being done to them. The experiments were designed in ways that made suffering inevitable and often severe. Unnecessary physical and mental injury was commonplace, and the operational utility of much of the research was speculative at best, hardly justifying the extreme risks to which subjects were exposed. The historical irony is profound. The United States had been instrumental in establishing the Nuremberg Code. American judges presided over the medical trials. American prosecutors argued that the Nazi experiments represented crimes against humanity precisely because they violated basic human dignity and autonomy. The trials established that national security concerns and military necessity could never justify experimenting on people without their consent. Yet, within just a few years, American intelligence agencies were conducting experiments that violated the same principles the United States had insisted were universal and inviolable. Some people within the CIA and the broader intelligence community did recognize that MKUltra was crossing ethical lines. Internal concerns were raised but ignored. There were individuals who expressed discomfort with the lack of consent, who questioned whether the potential intelligence value justified the human cost, who worried about the legal and moral implications of what was being done. But these voices were marginalized within a culture that prioritized operational effectiveness and secrecy over ethical reflection. The concerns came from various quarters. Some scientists who were approached to participate in MKUltra projects declined, uncomfortable with the lack of standard research protections. Some CIA officers who learned about specific experiments expressed misgivings to their superiors. Even some of the administrators who oversaw parts of the program occasionally questioned whether particular experiments went too far. But the institutional response to these concerns was consistent. They were noted and then dismissed as the cost of necessary work in a dangerous world. The dismissal of internal concerns was made easier by the program's compartmentalization. Those who raised questions often had limited visibility into the full scope of MKUltra. They might know about one troubling experiment but not realize it was part of a vast network of similar projects. They might express concern about one particular violation, but not understand that such violations were systematic rather than exceptional. The fragmentation of the program meant that no single person below the very top level could see the full picture, and those at the top level who could see it were the ones most invested in the program continuing. Moreover, the culture of the CIA during this period didn't reward ethical dissent. The agency saw itself as engaged in an existential struggle against Soviet communism. Officers who raised moral objections risked being seen as weak, naive, or unsuited for intelligence work. There was enormous pressure to be a team player, to trust that the leadership knew what they were doing, to accept that some things couldn't be questioned because national security depended on them remaining classified. In this environment, it took considerable courage to voice concerns, and those who did often found their careers stalling or their security clearances reviewed. The weakness of oversight was not accidental. Oversight was intentionally weak. The architects of MKUltra specifically designed the program to minimize external scrutiny by running it through. The technical services staff, they placed it within a division accustomed to sensitive operational work that didn't require detailed explanation. By using front organizations to fund research, they created layers of separation between the CIA and the actual experiments. By classifying virtually everything related to the program at the highest levels, they ensured that even congressional oversight, such as it existed, couldn't effectively monitor what was being done. Within the CIA itself, knowledge of MKUltra was restricted to a small circle. Most agency employees had no idea the program existed. Those who did know about it often understood only their small piece of it. Only a handful of senior officials had comprehensive knowledge of the program's scope and methods. This internal compartmentalization meant that even within the CIA, there was little collective awareness of what MKUltra entailed, and thus little opportunity for internal checks on its excesses. The congressional oversight committees that theoretically monitored intelligence activities were kept largely in the dark. During the 1950s and early 60s, Congress generally deferred to the CIA on operational matters, especially those classified as related to sources and methods. Briefings, when they occurred, were minimal and carefully crafted to avoid revealing information that might provoke difficult questions. The legislators who had oversight responsibilities often had limited staff and limited time to dig into the details of intelligence programs, and even when they asked questions, they could be told that providing answers would compromise national security, a claim difficult to challenge without access to classified information. This deliberately weak oversight structure served MKUltra's purposes perfectly. It created an environment where the program could operate for years without meaningful scrutiny, where violations could accumulate without correction, where the most extreme experiments could be conducted without anyone outside the program's leadership being in a position to object. The safeguards that normally exist in democratic societies, transparency, oversight, accountability, were systematically neutralized, creating a space where the program could metastasize unchecked. But even within this secret world, some in the CIA's leadership eventually became concerned that MKUltra's existence might someday become a liability. By the early 1970s, the political climate in the United States was changing. The Vietnam War had created deep skepticism about government claims regarding national security. Revelations about FBI surveillance of civil rights leaders and anti-war activists had undermined trust in federal law enforcement. There was a growing sense that intelligence agencies needed to be reined in, that secrecy had been abused, that oversight needed to be strengthened. In this environment, MKUltra represented an enormous risk. If the program's activities became public, the backlash would be severe. The experiments violated everything Americans believed about their country's values. The use of unwitting subjects, the exploitation of vulnerable populations, the disregard for human dignity, all of it would be indefensible in public discourse. And if records existed, they could be subpoenaed by Congress or discovered through legal proceedings. The paper trail that documented decades of illegal human experimentation would be an existential threat to the CIA's credibility and autonomy. Facing this risk, CIA Director Richard Helms made a decision. In 1973, as pressure was building for greater oversight of intelligence activities, Helms ordered records destroyed. The order was given to the head of the technical services staff: destroy all MKUltra files. It was an extraordinary directive, one that would ensure that future investigators could never fully understand what had been done, who had been harmed, and who had been responsible. Following Helms's order, thousands of documents were shredded. For days, CIA employees fed documents into shredders and incinerators. The files contained experimental protocols, lists of subjects, accounts of results, financial records, correspondence between researchers and handlers. They documented experiments across dozens of institutions, involving hundreds of researchers, affecting countless subjects. All of this was methodically destroyed, turned into confetti or ash, rendered irretrievable. The destruction was thorough, but not complete. Some documents survived because they were filed in other parts of the CIA's record system. Financial records related to MKUltra sub-projects, for instance, were maintained separately from the main program files and escaped destruction. But the vast majority of the program's documentation was eliminated. the detailed records of what experiments were conducted, on whom, with what results. Almost all of it was gone. This deliberate destruction of records limited future investigations profoundly. When Congress began investigating CIA activities in the mid-1970s, investigators found themselves confronting enormous gaps in the documentary record. They had testimony, some of it contradictory. They had the surviving financial documents, which revealed the existence of sub-projects, but often provided few details about what those sub-projects actually entailed. They had some subjects who came forward with accounts of what had been done to them, but they didn't have the comprehensive documentation that would have allowed them to piece together the full story. The Church Committee, the Senate investigation that examined intelligence abuses, managed to establish the basic outlines of MKUltra. They confirmed that the program had existed, that it had involved extensive human experimentation without informed consent, that it had used dangerous drugs and techniques, that it had caused harm to numerous people. But on question after question, how many people were affected, what exactly happened in many of the experiments, who specifically made certain decisions, the investigators ran into dead ends because the records that could have provided answers no longer existed. Only a fraction of records survived the destruction order. Historians and investigators working decades after the fact have had to reconstruct MKUltra's history from fragments. The surviving financial documents, cross-referenced with university archives and publication records, allowed researchers to identify some of the institutions and scientists involved. Declassified CIA documents from related programs provided context. Testimony from the limited investigations that did occur preserved some information, but enormous gaps remained and would remain forever. The destruction of records ensured that the full truth about MKUltra would never be known. One of the most tragic consequences of the document destruction was that survivors of the experiments were rarely identified. The CIA's files might have contained lists of subjects, information that could have allowed investigators to find people who had been experimented on and inform them of what had been done. This information could have helped victims understand symptoms they had experienced, seek appropriate treatment, or pursue compensation. But with the records destroyed, there was no systematic way to identify who had been subjected to MKUltra experiments. Some survivors came forward on their own, having learned through media coverage or congressional hearings that their experiences might have been part of the program. Some were able to piece together that the mysterious symptoms they had experienced, or the strange experiments they dimly recalled, were connected to CIA research. But these were exceptional cases, people who happened to have enough information to make the connection or who were determined enough to pursue answers despite the obstacles. For the vast majority of MKUltra's victims, many never learned what happened to them. They suffered psychological symptoms, memory problems, recurring nightmares, unexplained anxieties. Some received psychiatric treatment for conditions they and their doctors didn't realize had been induced by CIA experiments. Some struggled with substance abuse, turning to drugs or alcohol to cope with trauma whose source they couldn't identify. Some had their lives permanently altered by what had been done to them, without ever understanding why. The inability to identify and notify victims meant that the harm caused by MKUltra extended far beyond the immediate effects of the experiments. People lived with psychological damage and had no framework for understanding it. Families struggled with a member's changed behavior without knowing that it resulted from government experimentation. The ripple effects of trauma spread outward, affecting relationships, careers, and entire lives, all without the victims or their loved ones knowing the true cause. The destruction of records also prevented any meaningful accountability. without documentation of who ordered specific experiments, who carried them out, who participated in decisions to violate ethical and legal standards. It was impossible to hold individuals responsible. Sidney Gottlieb, who ran MKUltra, was never prosecuted. Richard Helms faced no criminal consequences for destroying the records. The researchers who conducted the most egregious experiments were never called to account for their actions. The institutional failure was acknowledged in general terms, but the individual actors who made it possible were shielded by the very document destruction that they or their superiors had orchestrated. The legacy of this destruction extends to the present day. Every attempt to understand MKUltra fully, every effort to provide justice or compensation to victims, every investigation into specific incidents runs into the same obstacle. The records don't exist. Researchers writing histories of. The program must constantly qualify their findings with acknowledgments that crucial information is unavailable. Lawyers representing victims must build cases on fragmentary evidence. Families seeking answers about what happened to their relatives must accept that definitive proof was deliberately eliminated. The order to destroy MKUltra records stands as a final violation, distinct from the experiments themselves, but deeply connected to them. It represented a decision to prioritize institutional protection over truth, to ensure that the full extent of the program's abuses would never be documented, to prevent accountability even at the cost of leaving victims in ignorance. It was an admission that what had been done was indefensible, combined with a determination to prevent anyone from fully documenting just how indefensible it was. And it worked. The destruction ensured that MKUltra would remain partially hidden, its full scope and impact unknowable, its victims largely unidentified, its perpetrators largely unpunished. For more than 20 years, MKUltra operated in the shadows, its activities known only to a small circle of CIA personnel and those directly involved in the experiments. The secrecy had held remarkably well. Despite the involvement of dozens of institutions and hundreds of researchers, despite the thousands of subjects who had been experimented upon, the program's existence remained hidden from public view. But in the 1970s, that secrecy began to crack. MKUltra was exposed in the 1970s, and the revelations would shock the nation and permanently alter the relationship between the American public and its intelligence agencies. The exposure didn't come from a single dramatic leak or whistleblower. Instead, it emerged gradually through multiple channels as a broader reckoning with intelligence community abuses took hold. The catalyst was the political climate of the era. The Watergate scandal had destroyed public trust in government institutions and demonstrated that even the highest officials were capable of illegal conduct and systematic cover-ups. Revelations about FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's files and the Bureau's COINTELPRO operations against civil rights leaders and political activists had shown that domestic surveillance and political harassment were endemic. The Vietnam War and the Pentagon Papers had revealed systematic deception about military policy. In this environment of widespread mistrust, the intelligence agencies came under unprecedented scrutiny. The first public hint of MKUltra came in December 1974, when journalist Seymour Hersh published a story in the New York Times, revealing that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic surveillance operations against American citizens, including anti-war activists and political dissidents. The article, based on information from sources within the intelligence community, described programs that violated the CIA's charter, which restricted it to foreign intelligence operations. The revelations created immediate political pressure for investigation. President Gerald Ford, who had taken office after Richard Nixon's resignation, responded by establishing a commission to investigate CIA activities. The Rockefeller Commission, named for its chairman, Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, was tasked with examining whether the CIA had exceeded its authority and violated the rights of American citizens. The commission began its work in early 1975, interviewing CIA officials, reviewing documents, and hearing testimony about various agency programs. It was during the Rockefeller Commission's investigation that the Frank Olson case first came to public attention. As investigators dug into CIA activities, they came across references to an Army scientist who had died after being given LSD in a CIA experiment. The Commission's report, released in June 1975, included a brief mention of this incident, though Olson was not initially named. Journalists quickly identified him, and the revelation that the CIA had dosed one of its own collaborators with LSD, leading to his death, created a sensation. But the Rockefeller Commission's mandate was limited, and its investigation was constrained by the fact that it was essentially the executive branch investigating itself. The Commission examined the program, but its scope was carefully bounded. The report acknowledged wrongdoing but minimized the extent of MKUltra's activities and the severity of its violations. It was clear that a more independent and thorough investigation would be needed. Congress stepped into that role with vigor. The Church Committee, formerly known as the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, was established in early 1975 under the chairmanship of Senator Frank Church of Idaho. The committee investigated CIA abuses along with those of other intelligence agencies, including the FBI and NSA. Its mandate was broad, to examine whether intelligence agencies had violated the law, exceeded their authority, or acted improperly. The Church Committee's investigation of the CIA was exhaustive. Investigators interviewed hundreds of witnesses, reviewed thousands of documents, and held public hearings that brought the hidden world of intelligence operations into the light. The committee had subpoena power and used it aggressively, compelling CIA officials to testify and produce records. Unlike the Rockefeller Commission, the Church Committee was willing to publicly confront the intelligence community about its activities. As the Church Committee dug into CIA programs, MKUltra emerged as one of the most disturbing findings. Investigators discovered the surviving financial records that Richard Helms's destruction order had missed. These documents revealed the existence of 149 sub-projects, contracts with dozens of institutions, and expenditures running into millions of dollars over more than a decade. The pattern of funding through front organizations became clear, as did the program's systematic use of unwitting subjects. Congressional hearings confirmed non-consensual experiments on a massive scale. In August 1977, the Senate held televised hearings specifically focused on MKUltra. Senator Edward Kennedy, whose subcommittee on health had jurisdiction over human experimentation issues, led questioning of CIA officials. The hearings laid out for public consumption the basic facts of the program: that the CIA had conducted extensive experiments involving drugs, primarily LSD, on unwitting American citizens, that these experiments had been conducted without informed consent, that subjects had included civilians, prisoners, mental, patients, and even CIA employees, that some subjects had suffered severe psychological damage. The testimony during these hearings was often stunning. CIA officials admitted wrongdoing in ways that were unprecedented. Admiral Stansfield Turner, who was CIA director at the time of the hearings, acknowledged that the agency had conducted experiments that violated ethical and legal standards. He confirmed that subjects had been given LSD without their knowledge or consent. He admitted that the agency had failed to maintain adequate oversight of the program and that researchers had been permitted to conduct experiments that should never have been approved. Turner's admissions were carefully calibrated. He expressed regret for what had been done and acknowledged that it was wrong. But he also consistently emphasized that these activities had occurred under previous leadership, that they reflected a different era in the CIA's history, and that current agency leadership was committed to ensuring such abuses wouldn't happen again. There was an element of distancing in his testimony, an attempt to separate the 1970s CIA from the organization that had created and sustained MKUltra. Other CIA officials who testified were more defensive. Some claimed that the experiments had been justified by national security concerns, that the Soviet threat had required the agency to explore every possible avenue for maintaining advantage. Some argued that ethical standards had been different in the 1950s and 60s, that the program should be judged by the norms of its time rather than by contemporary standards. These arguments gained little traction with the committee members or the public watching the televised hearings. Throughout the hearings, the agency claimed much evidence was lost. This became a consistent refrain from CIA witnesses. When asked about specific experiments, they would often respond that the records had been destroyed and they couldn't provide details. When pressed on how many people had been subjected to experiments, they couldn't give precise numbers because the documentation no longer existed. When asked to identify all the institutions involved or all the researchers who had participated, they pointed to the gaps in the record. This claim of lost evidence was factually accurate but also strategically useful for the CIA. It allowed officials to acknowledge wrongdoing in general terms while avoiding specifics that might be even more damaging or that might provide grounds for criminal prosecution. It meant that questions about the most extreme experiments, about deaths or permanent injuries that might have occurred, about the full extent of the program's activities, could all be met with expressions of regret combined with assertions that complete answers were impossible. The Church Committee's final report, released in April 1976, provided the most comprehensive public accounting of MKUltra that would ever be produced. The report detailed the program's history, structure, and methods. It described the use of unwitting subjects, the lack of informed consent, the involvement of vulnerable populations. It made clear that MKUltra had violated both legal and ethical standards. The report's language was measured but damning, documenting systematic abuses that had continued for years with minimal oversight and no accountability. One of the most powerful aspects of the congressional investigations was that victims testified before Congress. These weren't abstract accounts of wrongdoing or bureaucratic parsing of what had occurred. These were real people, many of them visibly damaged by what had been done to them, telling their stories in public. Their testimony put a human face on MKUltra's victims and made it impossible to dismiss the program as a mere historical footnote or an abstract ethical lapse. Some victims who testified were people who had been institutionalized for psychiatric treatment and experimented upon without their knowledge. They described being given drugs repeatedly, being subjected to extended periods of unconsciousness, emerging from treatment with significant memory loss and cognitive impairment. They spoke about how their lives had been permanently altered, how they had lost abilities and memories they once had, how they had been left to cope with damage they didn't understand for years or decades. Others who testified had been research subjects at universities or hospitals, recruited for studies under false pretenses. They described experiences of being given LSD or other drugs without warning, of terrifying psychological reactions, of lasting trauma from experiences they couldn't contextualize at the time. Some spoke about how learning, years later, that their experiences had been part of CIA experiments had been both a relief, finally having an explanation for what had happened, and a betrayal, realizing that their government had deliberately subjected them to harm. The testimony of Harold Blauer's daughters was particularly moving. Blauer had died in 1953 after being given repeated injections of mescaline derivatives as part of an Army experiment related to MKUltra. His death had been covered up for years, with his family told only that he had died during psychiatric treatment. When the truth emerged in the 1970s, his adult daughters testified about the decades of deception and the impact of finally learning how their father had actually died. Following the investigations and public hearings, there was significant pressure to compensate victims. The government's response was uneven at best. Some received financial settlements, typically those who were able to definitively prove they had been subjects of MKUltra experiments and who had suffered documentable harm. The Olson family received their settlement after Frank Olson was identified as the CIA scientist who had died after being dosed with LSD. Some other victims who could be identified through the surviving records also received compensation. The settlements that were paid were often substantial by the standards of the time, but inadequate to the harm caused. Hundreds of thousands of dollars might be paid to someone who had been permanently disabled by CIA experiments, who had lost years of their life to psychological damage, who had been deprived of the ability to work or maintain relationships. The money could never truly compensate for what had been taken, but it at least represented some acknowledgement of responsibility. However, most victims received no compensation at all. The destruction of records meant that many people who had been experimented upon couldn't prove their involvement in the program. Without documentation showing that they had been subjects, their claims could be dismissed as unprovable. The CIA, while acknowledging that experiments had occurred and that many people had been harmed, took the position that it couldn't compensate people whose participation couldn't be verified. This created a perverse situation where the very act of destroying records, itself a wrongful attempt to conceal illegal activity, became a shield against liability. The agency could say that it would compensate proven victims while knowing that its own destruction of evidence made proof impossible in most cases. Victims were left in the position of knowing they had been experimented on, having memories or symptoms consistent with MKUltra experiments, but being unable to access records that would have proven their involvement because those records had been deliberately destroyed. Some victims attempted to sue the government, seeking compensation through the courts rather than relying on voluntary settlements. These lawsuits faced enormous obstacles. The doctrine of sovereign immunity limited the circumstances under which the government could be sued. Claims were often dismissed on procedural grounds before reaching the merits. When cases did proceed, the government invoked state secrets privilege, arguing that litigation would require disclosure of classified information that would harm national security. The combination of destroyed evidence, legal immunities, and classification claims made successful lawsuits extremely difficult. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the post-exposure period was that no senior officials were prosecuted. Despite clear evidence that MKUltra had violated numerous laws, despite testimony about systematic abuses, despite admissions of wrongdoing from CIA officials themselves, no one faced criminal charges. Sidney Gottlieb, who had run the program and overseen its most egregious experiments, was never indicted. Richard Helms, who had ordered the destruction of records, faced no prosecution for that obstruction. The researchers who had conducted experiments on unwitting subjects were never charged with assault or any other crime. The reasons for this lack of prosecution were complex. Some of the conduct had occurred too long ago for statutes of limitations. The destruction of records made it difficult to prove specific criminal acts beyond a reasonable doubt. There was concern that prosecutions would require disclosure of information that was still classified. But perhaps most significantly, there was a reluctance within the political system to criminalize the actions of intelligence officers who claimed to have been serving their country, even when those actions clearly violated the law. The decision not to prosecute reflected a broader ambivalence about how to respond to intelligence abuses. There was genuine outrage at what MKUltra represented, authentic shock at the scope and severity of the violations. But there was also discomfort with the idea of sending former CIA officials to prison for activities they had conducted under official authority with the approval of their superiors in programs that had existed for years without anyone stopping them. The result was a kind of accountability that acknowledged wrongdoing without imposing the consequences that normally follow from serious crimes. The Church Committee's work led to significant reforms in how intelligence agencies were overseen. Permanent congressional intelligence committees were established to provide ongoing monitoring of CIA and other agency activities. New regulations were put in place governing human subjects research. The CIA itself implemented new review procedures and oversight mechanisms. These reforms represented genuine attempts to prevent future abuses and to ensure that programs like MKUltra couldn't operate in the shadows again. But for the victims of MKUltra, these reforms came too late. For those who had suffered psychological damage, who had lost years of their lives, who carried trauma they couldn't fully understand, the assurances that it wouldn't happen again provided little comfort. They had been used as test subjects in illegal experiments, and while their government had eventually acknowledged this, the acknowledgement came with limited accountability and inadequate compensation. The exposure of MKUltra brought the program to an end and created a historical record of what had occurred. But it couldn't undo the harm, couldn't restore what had been taken, couldn't provide full justice to those who had been violated. The reckoning, such as it was, remained incomplete. The machinery of MKUltra ground to a halt before the public ever learned of its existence. MKUltra officially ended in 1973, the same year that Richard Helms ordered the destruction of its records. The termination came not from ethical awakening or external pressure, but from a pragmatic assessment that the program had failed to deliver on its promises. After 2 decades and millions of dollars, the quest for reliable methods of mind control had produced disappointing results. LSD and other drugs didn't create controllable, programmable subjects. Hypnosis couldn't reliably override a person's will or moral constraints. Sensory deprivation and psychological torture could break people down, but couldn't rebuild them according to a predetermined pattern. The CIA had documented in excruciating detail what could destroy psychological stability, but it had learned relatively little about how to control or direct human consciousness with precision. The techniques that worked, prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, drugs, psychological abuse, were effective at inflicting suffering and breaking down resistance, but they were crude instruments that produced unpredictable results. They might cause someone to confess or comply in the moment, but they didn't create the kind of lasting, reliable behavioral control that the program had sought. By the early 1970s, even the program's advocates had to acknowledge that the operational utility didn't justify the continued investment. The formal end of MKUltra didn't mean the CIA abandoned all interest in behavioral modification or interrogation techniques. Some of the methods developed or studied under MKUltra would resurface in later interrogation programs, their origins obscured by the passage of time and the destruction of records. But as an organized, funded program of research into mind control, MKUltra ceased to exist. The sub-projects were closed, the contracts with universities and researchers were terminated, and the institutional focus shifted to other priorities. The exposure of MKUltra in the mid-1970s created intense pressure for reform. Congress, shocked by the scope of intelligence community abuses revealed by the Church Committee and other investigations, moved to establish new frameworks for oversight and accountability. New intelligence oversight laws followed the revelations, fundamentally restructuring the relationship between the intelligence agencies and the legislative branch. The most significant reform was the establishment of permanent intelligence oversight committees in both the House and Senate. Prior to the 1970s, congressional oversight of intelligence activities had been minimal and ad hoc. The CIA had operated with extraordinary autonomy, providing limited briefings to a handful of senior legislators and resisting most attempts at scrutiny. The new committees had dedicated staff, regular access to intelligence information, and the authority to conduct ongoing monitoring of agency activities. The oversight reforms included requirements for the intelligence agencies to notify Congress of significant activities, including covert operations. While these notification requirements had exceptions and loopholes, they represented a substantial change from the previous system where agencies could conduct major programs for years without any congressional awareness. The reforms also established procedures for handling classified information that allowed legislators to receive sensitive briefings while maintaining security. Beyond legislation, executive orders restricted human experimentation by government agencies. President Gerald Ford issued an executive order in 1976 that placed new limits on intelligence activities, including restrictions on experimentation involving drugs. Later presidents expanded and refined these restrictions. The orders required informed consent for any research involving human subjects conducted or funded by intelligence agencies. They prohibited the use of drugs or other substances on unwitting subjects, except in very limited circumstances with high-level approval. These executive orders were significant because they didn't rely on congressional action and couldn't be easily circumvented by classification claims. They represented policy decisions by presidents that the intelligence agencies were bound to follow. While executive orders can be modified or revoked by subsequent presidents, the restrictions on human experimentation became embedded enough in policy and culture that removing them would be politically difficult and highly visible. Parallel to these government reforms, institutional review standards were strengthened across the entire research enterprise. The National Research Act of 1974, passed in response to multiple scandals, including both MKUltra and the Tuskegee syphilis study, established institutional review boards as mandatory gatekeepers for human subjects research. Any institution receiving federal funding for research had to establish IRBs that would review proposed studies to ensure they met ethical standards, including informed consent, minimization of risk, and protection of vulnerable populations. The IRB system wasn't perfect, and critics would later point out ways it could be circumvented, or how it sometimes became a rubber stamp for institutional research priorities. But it represented a fundamental shift in how human subjects research was conducted in the United States. The days when a researcher could simply recruit subjects and conduct experiments without external review were over. The system created checks that made it much harder for programs like MKUltra to operate, even in classified settings, because institutional oversight now existed as a separate layer of accountability. In the decades since its exposure, the CIA's posture toward MKUltra has evolved. Today, the CIA acknowledges MKUltra publicly as part of its history. The agency's official website includes information about the program, describing it as a series of experiments conducted during the Cold War that involved the use of drugs and other techniques. The acknowledgement is carefully worded, contextualizing the program within the period's national security concerns while recognizing that it violated ethical standards. This public acknowledgement represents a calculated approach to managing a difficult history. By openly discussing MKUltra rather than denying or obscuring it, the CIA can claim transparency and demonstrate that the organization has moved past the abuses of earlier eras. The acknowledgement allows the agency to control the narrative to some extent, framing MKUltra as a historical aberration rather than as something that reveals fundamental problems with how intelligence agencies operate when given too much autonomy and too little oversight. But the acknowledgement is necessarily incomplete. The full scope remains unknown and unknowable. The destruction of records in 1973 ensured that comprehensive understanding of MKUltra's activities would be impossible. Historians and investigators have pieced together a substantial amount of information from surviving documents, testimony, institutional records, and other sources. But enormous gaps remain. How many people were experimented on? No one knows for certain. What happened in many of the 149 sub-projects? The records that could answer that question were shredded. The limitations on knowledge extend to questions about outcomes and consequences. How many people died as a result of MKUltra experiments? Beyond Frank Olson and a few other documented cases, it's impossible to say. How many people suffered permanent psychological damage? The number is surely significant, but precise accounting is impossible. Did experiments continue in some form after the program officially ended? The destroyed records prevent definitive answers. Each unanswerable question represents not just a gap in historical knowledge, but a dimension of harm that can never be fully documented or remedied. Despite these gaps, or perhaps because of them, MKUltra has had a profound and lasting impact on American culture and politics. MKUltra reshaped public trust in government in ways that persist to this day. Before the program's exposure, many Americans assumed that their government, whatever its flaws in other areas, would not deliberately harm its own citizens, would not conduct secret experiments on unwitting subjects, would not violate basic ethical principles in the name of national security. MKUltra shattered those assumptions. The revelation that the CIA had, for more than 2 decades, conducted experiments that violated every standard of medical ethics and human dignity fundamentally altered how many people viewed government institutions. If the CIA could do this, what else might agencies be doing in secret? If such systematic abuses could continue for years without detection, what did that say about the effectiveness of oversight and accountability mechanisms? If senior officials could order the destruction of evidence and face no consequences, what did that mean for the rule of law? This erosion of trust extended beyond the intelligence community to government more broadly. MKUltra became part of a larger narrative of government deception and abuse that included Watergate, COINTELPRO, the Pentagon Papers, and other revelations of the 1970s. Together, these scandals created a lasting skepticism about official narratives and government claims. The phrase conspiracy theory took on new valence when actual conspiracies, real secret programs that violated law and ethics, were being exposed and documented. The impact on trust has proven lasting. Polling data over subsequent decades consistently shows that Americans express lower levels of trust in government institutions than they did before the 1970s. While many factors contributed to this decline, the exposure of programs like MKUltra played a significant role. The knowledge that such abuses had occurred, combined with the limited accountability that followed, created enduring cynicism about government power and skepticism about official assurances that appropriate safeguards exist. The program's impact extends into professional education and ethical training. MKUltra is taught in ethics, law, and psychology programs across the country and around the world. In medical ethics courses, it serves as a case study in research violations and the importance of informed consent. Students learning about the Nuremberg Code and subsequent regulations study MKUltra as an example of how easily ethical principles can be abandoned when secrecy eliminates accountability and when researchers convince themselves that extraordinary circumstances justify extraordinary measures. In law schools, MKUltra appears in discussions of government accountability, sovereign immunity, classification systems, and the limits of executive power. It illustrates how legal protections can fail when activities are conducted in secret and when oversight mechanisms are deliberately weakened. It raises questions about how to ensure accountability when the doctrine of state secrets can be invoked to prevent judicial review and when official records can be destroyed to prevent investigation. Psychology programs examine MKUltra as part of the history of their discipline, a dark chapter that reveals how easily scientific inquiry can be corrupted when divorced from ethical constraints. The program is taught alongside other abuses like the Tuskegee study as examples of why institutional review boards exist and why informed consent is non-negotiable. Students learn about the researchers who participated in MKUltra, many of them respected figures in their fields, as cautionary examples of how professional prestige and scientific curiosity can lead people to participate in fundamentally unethical work. The program also features prominently in intelligence studies and courses on national security law. Students studying to work in intelligence agencies or related fields learn about MKUltra as an example of what happens when operational imperatives override ethical considerations, when secrecy becomes an end in itself, and when the absence of oversight allows programs to drift into abuse. The case is used to justify current oversight mechanisms and to emphasize the importance of ethical constraints, even in the context of classified national security work. One of the most significant aspects of MKUltra's legacy is that it disproved claims that mind control fears were imaginary. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, people who suggested that the government might be conducting secret experiments on citizens were dismissed as paranoid or delusional. The idea that the CIA would drug unwitting subjects, conduct psychological torture, or attempt to develop mind control techniques was treated as the province of conspiracy theorists and alarmists. But MKUltra proved that these supposedly paranoid fears were based in reality. This validation of what had been dismissed as conspiracy thinking has had complex consequences. On one hand, it created appropriate skepticism about official denials and made people more willing to question government assurances that concerning activities weren't happening. The response, "Trust us, we wouldn't do that," lost much of its power after MKUltra showed that intelligence agencies absolutely would do things they later had to admit were unconscionable. On the other hand, the revelation that one conspiracy was real has sometimes been used to lend credibility to far less plausible conspiracy theories. The logic becomes, they really were conducting secret mind control experiments, so maybe other seemingly outlandish claims about government activities are also true. This dynamic has complicated public discourse, making it harder to distinguish between legitimate skepticism based on documented government abuses and unfounded conspiracy theories that lack evidence. But the fundamental point remains valid. MKUltra demonstrated that fears of secret government experimentation on unwitting citizens weren't paranoid fantasy, but documented reality. The program's existence proved that agencies with sufficient secrecy and autonomy will sometimes engage in activities that violate law, ethics, and basic human rights. That proof has shaped how subsequent government claims about classified programs are received and evaluated. Ultimately, MKUltra stands as a warning about secrecy, power, and unchecked authority. The program's history illustrates a set of lessons that remain relevant decades after the experiments ended. It shows what happens when secrecy eliminates accountability, when oversight is deliberately weakened, when classification systems are used to hide wrongdoing rather than protect legitimate national security interests. It demonstrates how otherwise intelligent and educated people can participate in unconscionable activities when those activities are shrouded in secrecy and justified by appeals to national security. The warning extends to the culture that enabled MKUltra. The program didn't result from a few bad actors or rogue operators. It was an institutional effort, authorized at the highest levels, sustained for more than 2 decades, involving dozens of institutions and hundreds of researchers. This wasn't an aberration, but a logical extension of a culture that prioritized operational imperatives over ethical constraints, that treated secrecy as more important than accountability, that convinced itself that the ends justified any means. MKUltra also warns about the limits of post hoc accountability. Even after the program was exposed, even after congressional investigations and public hearings, even after official acknowledgments of wrongdoing, the consequences were limited. No senior officials were prosecuted. Many victims received no compensation. The destruction of records prevented full documentation of what had occurred. The reforms that followed, while significant, couldn't undo the harm or provide complete justice. This pattern suggests that preventing abuses through robust oversight and ethical constraints is far more effective than trying to achieve accountability after the fact. The program serves as a reminder that democratic governance requires transparency and accountability to function. When activities are conducted in complete secrecy, when oversight is minimal or absent, when evidence can be destroyed to prevent investigation, the normal safeguards that prevent abuse in democratic societies cease to function. Power without accountability, operating in the dark, will inevitably be misused. That's not a partisan statement or a criticism of particular institutions. It's a structural observation about how power operates and why transparency and accountability are essential. More than 50 years after MKUltra officially ended, the program remains relevant not just as history but as a warning. The specific techniques the CIA explored, the drugs, the sensory deprivation, the psychological manipulation, may be dated, but the underlying dynamics that enabled the program remain possible wherever secrecy and power combine without adequate oversight. The lesson isn't that MKUltra couldn't happen again. It's that without constant vigilance, without robust oversight, without a commitment to transparency and accountability, something like it could absolutely happen again. That's perhaps the most important legacy of MKUltra. Not just the specific reforms it prompted or the historical record of what occurred, but the ongoing reminder that trust in institutions must be earned through transparency and accountability, that secrecy is a tool that can easily be abused, and that the price of preventing such abuses is eternal vigilance. The victims of MKUltra paid a terrible price to teach these lessons. The question that remains is whether subsequent generations will remember what they learned, or whether the warnings will fade with time until new abuses make them relevant once again.